We do now come to the backbench debate on International Women's Day. Mrs Maria Miller to move.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm sure it's worth waiting. I beg to move the motion on behalf of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Women in Parliament in my name. Madam Deputy Speaker, there is a dreadful poignancy in opening this debate today. The bombing of a Ukrainian women and children's hospital yesterday has left pregnant women on stretchers, covered in blood from shrapnel wounds. And I would hope that the message from this place that we send to every woman in Ukraine during this week of events to mark International Women's Day is that we stand with you. We stand with those women as those who, against those who wage war on our country, on their country. And we stand alongside those women in their battle for a free and independent Ukraine. And we stand with the people of Belarus and Russia who don't want war. And I was delighted to meet the Belarusian opposition leader, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, in Parliament today to reinforce that message. In Ukraine, International Women's Day is usually a public holiday, an opportunity to mark the unique role that women play in the culture of their nation. But this year has been very different indeed, because it's the women of Ukraine who make up the vast majority of refugees. My honourable friend, the Minister on the front bench, will share my horror, I'm sure, at seeing those women flee their homeland. And my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, is absolutely right to be redoubling the government's efforts to cut unnecessary bureaucracy so that we can offer those women who seek sanctuary in our country swift passage. Acts of war and aggression disproportionately affect women. In Afghanistan, just 12 months ago on International Women's Day, that nation celebrated the remarkable contribution made by Afghan women to the challenges of the COVID pandemic. Now, the hard-won progress made on women's rights over the last 2 decades has been all but reversed, with a new Taliban government having no place for the 67 women elected to the Afghan parliament. We know the best way we can fight dictatorships and autocracies around the world is through support for democratic capacity, for effective democratic institutions. And the truth is that every democracy is fragile. It has to be nurtured. So as we mark International Women's Day, as parliamentarians, we should, I believe, focus every fibre of our body on how we can strengthen democracies around the world, because democracy is under threat like never before. Strong parliamentarians are representative of their people. Women playing their proper role in Parliament isn't an optional extra. It's essential for our legitimacy. And this year's theme of breaking the bias couldn't be more appropriate, because there are few democracies around the world where women have an equal role in policy making and policy scrutiny, including our own. 27 years on from the 1995 UN Beijing Platform for Action, which demanded worldwide equal participation for women in political decision-making, we've seen slow progress, with just 1 in 4 elected representatives around the world being a woman. So for International Women's Day 2022, let's call for a renewed commitment to women's equal role in policy making and policy scrutiny to ensure progress in securing women's roles in democratic institutions. Internationally, both our Parliament and our government in the UK actively support women and girls' rights. The government, through Education for Girls and its support for organisations like the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, that works hard to help build women's political participation. And here in Parliament, many of us are members of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians, and we work with legislative bodies around the world to share our expertise and our knowledge. Gender-sensitive parliament audits are a practical support the CPA have put in place for jurisdictions to address their institutionalised gender inequality. And over the last year, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association in the UK have trained women parliamentarians around the world to deal with online abuse, helping to find a way forward on one of the issues that holds so many women back from wanting to seek election in the first place. We want strong democracies around the world, but it's also never been more important for our own Parliament to be an exemplar. In Westminster, there are still twice as many men as there are women elected to this place, demonstrating the challenges even embedded democracies have. And I stand here as a Conservative Member of Parliament to say there are 3 men for every 1 woman in my party, which is the government party. That has to change. Each party takes this problem extremely seriously, and I know the Conservative Party does. And we're acting. And it's right that we press government and political parties to do more, but Parliament itself has to act too, as the custodian of one of the most important parts of our democracy is our legislature. Sue Maguire highlighted in her report to government on this matter in 2018 that whilst quotas for women to come into Parliament have a place, and the Labour Party have made good use of them, they don't address the cultural and working practices in Parliament and local government that remain significant barriers. So we can and must challenge the government to do more and parties to act. But if we simply say it's the fault of political parties, we're not listening to the mountain of evidence to the contrary. Now, I'd like to applaud Mr. Speaker for creating a real momentum for change here, even before he was Speaker, for the first time addressing issues like personal security of members. But we also now have a behaviour code, and we have grievance procedures thanks to my right honourable friend, the member for South Northamptonshire. We have proxy voting for new parents and effective procedures to deal with bullying, as we saw a little earlier this week. But what about the other measures that have been put forward? Where's the progress there? Affecting change in this place can feel almost impossible. And whilst we have select committees to hold the government to account, where's the mechanism to hold ourselves to account? There's no structure within Parliament for members to identify a programme of coordinated change, a coherent and transparent and accountable change that will make this place somewhere that more women want to come to and to stay. As the Women and Equality Select Committee report published last week by my right honourable friend, the member for the chairman of the Select Committee, Romsey, the member for Romsey, said, 5 years on from the Child's Good Parliament report, and 10 more reports like that, Madam Deputy Speaker, many of the recommendations that have been put forward remain unanswered. Now, some of the actions can be delivered by Parliament, and some need Parliament to work with government. But what we need, above all, is a coordinated plan of action for our House of Commons to get our House in order, to get equal representation of women as a top priority. And I'd like to just give a couple of examples before I draw my comments to a close. To ensure the government implements Section 106 of the Equality Act, which is already in place, to require parties to publish data on the diversity of their candidates and to appoint appointments to the House of Lords, a recommendation made more than 5 years ago. That we can focus our House service public engagement on women's participation in democracy, reaching out to women across the United Kingdom to consider standing for election in the way that we did in the APPG event on Tuesday evening, attended by more than 100 women. But those events shouldn't be held by members, they should be held by the House of Commons to be encouraging more women to stand for election. We need to focus the House Communications team to talk about the positive changes we've already made to our culture here as a result of the new behaviour code and the grievance process. We need to work with the government to ensure legislation and enforcement against online threats which disproportionately affect women members. And we need an embedding of a programme of training for members who are using social media. Actions we know that need to happen, but we need to have a plan, and there needs to be accountability for swift progress. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are the custodians of our legislative body, and I thank the Backbench Business Committee for securing the time for this debate today, and for the APPG officers and members for their support in this debate today. A representative and inclusive House of Commons is essential for the fully effective functioning of a parliamentary democracy. The House itself has a unique responsibility to take steps to make sure that we are representative of the population. Recruiting good people is a matter for political parties, but parties can't change what people think of Parliament, how they feel about working in the House of Commons. And I want the debate that we're having today to mark International Women's Day to be a call for action for our own Parliament. As members, we need to ensure the House of Commons is a place everyone aspires to be part of, including women.
The question is as on the order paper. Colleagues will see that there are a good number of speakers for today's debate. Don't really want to impose a time limit, so my advice would be to speak for within 6 to 7 minutes, and that way we'll get everybody in. Colleen Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Lady from Basingstoke, and I want to associate myself with her comments, especially those regarding the women and children of Ukraine. Disagreements are par for the course in this place. So often we are divided, yet occasionally there are issues that bring us together, that unify our sense of purpose and drive us towards collective goals that can deliver a brighter, fairer and more equal future. This is one such issue, and the tenor and tone of today's debate is testament to that unanimity. Ensuring we can debate International Women's Day is so very important. It gives us a chance to reflect on where we are as a society and on the progress we have made to date on gender equality. But equally, it helps to highlight how much further we still must go to achieve true equality, and marks a call to collective action and shared responsibility for delivering and accelerating gender balance. While it's clear we've come a long way and made significant progress in recent decades, we still have a mammoth task ahead of us to achieve full gender equality. The gender pay gap still exists. Women continue to face workplace discrimination, misogynistic abuse is rife, violence against women and girls persists, and women still fall behind men in terms of healthcare and education. While these inequalities remain, the need to mark International Women's Day is stronger than ever. Of course, this is particularly true given the impact of COVID-19, which hit women disproportionately hard and which analysis suggests could have put gender equality back decades. Indeed, at the height of the pandemic, a report looked at the impact of COVID-19 on women in my city of Coventry. It found that pre-existing inequalities in debt, violence, healthcare, employment and childcare had been exacerbated. The report warned that unless a gender-sensitive approach was taken to rebuilding the country and economy, decades of progress towards achieving gender equality could be reversed. So I call on the government to review the impact of their policies on women and to ensure the recovery from the pandemic is an equal recovery with women at its heart. While International Women's Day provides an opportunity to shine a light on such inequalities, it's also a time to celebrate the social, economic, cultural and political achievements of women. In Coventry, one initiative from the Godiva Trust will see residents pay tribute to women that are special to them by helping to decorate some trees that are placed around the city. People are being invited to attach messages to the trees' branches to celebrate the lives of inspiring women. That made me think about the inspirational women who have touched my life and who my message would be about. I'm privileged to say there have been many influential women in my life, but I want to pay a special tribute to my mum and my two sisters. My mum was my single biggest inspiration. Without my mum's influence, without her leading the way and showing me that the only thing that limits you in this world is your imagination, and most of all, without her love and support, I would not be here. I would not be here where I am today. When my mum entered politics some 50 years ago, I think that's when I entered it, actually, little did I know then that politics would become such a large part of my life and would lead me right here as the 414th woman ever elected to this place. While my two sisters didn't follow the same path, politics nonetheless plays a part in their lives. They support me, they share my concerns, experience my highs and lows. They give me my sense of resilience, and we share a mutual trust and an unconditional love. They are my biggest critics and my staunchest defenders. I know they are proud of me, as I am of them. So as we mark International Women's Day, let's pay tribute to those closest to us, our carers, our mothers, grandmothers, sisters and aunts, the often unsung heroes who nurture and guide us, who shape our futures through their sacrifices and selfless actions, and whose very presence contributes to who and what we are today, even if we don't always recognise it. The women whose achievements are so great, yet are so often and so easily overlooked. The women whose achievements epitomise the spirit of International Women's Day.
Caroline Noakes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it is an absolute pleasure to see you in the chair. International Women's Day is a day to celebrate, and I have doggedly this year looked for things to celebrate, perhaps with a very grim sense of determination. But I am going to start with a focus on a very few positive things, and I'm actually going to start with talking about a young boy who on Monday said to me in his school assembly, "Tomorrow's International Women's Day, what are you doing to celebrate?" And I thought, that is how far we've come. Even 12-year-old boys wish to celebrate alongside us. So thank you, Hugo, for asking me what I was going to do, and I told him that I would speak in today's debate and I would celebrate international women. And I also want to celebrate female entrepreneurship in this country. I've been this morning at number 11 Downing Street with the brilliant women of the British Beauty Council talking about their new project to launch jobs in STEM and beauty, focusing on the fact that science and beauty go hand in hand, and we have to make sure that brilliant women in this country study science subjects and go on to fabulous careers in scientific areas. And we heard from an amazing woman, Chiumi Siwoku, who spoke about her journey into the beauty industry via science-based A-level. She was meant to be a doctor, she was meant to study medicine, but her act of rebellion was to make sure that she went into beauty, and my goodness, I love rebellious women. They're the ones who push boundaries, break down barriers, and do the unexpected. And I want to talk about the female entrepreneurs I met somewhere far more traditional this week at Goldman Sachs. They were absolute leaders in their fields. And I want to specifically talk about a very young woman, Turia Wenbar, who's the CEO of ePharmacy, and talk about her excitement to be launching menopause products over the counter. And she was in her 20s still and talking about the menopause. And that shows how far we've come, and it pays tribute to the work of my, I was going to say honourable friend, she is my honourable friend, the member for Swansea East, who has done so much to break down those taboos and stigma around the menopause. And Turia spoke absolutely unashamedly of her determination to create prosperity, to create jobs for other women. And she spoke about bias, her personal bias, in employing more women in her organisation. That is one bias we do not wish to break. And I'd also like to pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Lewis, who has done so much work around the menopause, around women's health, and we can look forward to, in a very few short weeks, the female health strategy coming forward. And I would like to say that as the Minister for Patient Safety and Primary Care, she has been a breath of fresh air. On staying on that theme, I also wish to say that I look forward to the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport making real difference with her forthcoming online safety legislation. That could be a real game changer for young women, and indeed men, for whom the online harms they currently face every single day can spill over into real life. And I have no doubt about her mission and determination to bring forward a fiercely effective piece of law. And there are other colleagues, my honourable friend, the member for Sevenoaks, who is here, who's done so much brilliant work around Botox. It seems really trivial to be talking this morning about the beauty industry and lipstick and to be talking about Botox and her legislation, her private member's bill, which makes it illegal to give Botox to the under 18s. We need to be protecting young women from the dangers of injectables and cosmetic procedures that can go horribly wrong. They can alter their looks forever. And actually we need to be protecting young women from that Love Island identical face, which actually looks pretty awful. And I'd like to celebrate the brilliant female scientists who made vaccines for COVID possible. But actually today I don't want to celebrate at all. I want to talk about International Women's Day. and the women we've seen in war, impacted by the Putin invasion of Ukraine, killed by the war, reporting on the war, whether as a journalist or a citizen journalist via social media, whether it's the doctors in the hospitals tending to the sick and the wounded, whether it's the maternity hospitals we have seen bombed. And I want to talk about one specific woman, Yaroslava Antipina. I don't know her. I'd never heard of her before the war started, but she's keeping a daily diary of her life in war. And I know from what she's written, she wants to have her life back. She wants to be able to drink coffee in peace with the people she has met on Twitter. She's fled her home, and I wonder what it would feel like for all of us if we had been forced out of our homes and made to live again with our mothers in a different part of the country. She has taught me that in Ukraine, International Women's Day is a holiday. Well, there's a great idea. Perhaps we could introduce that here. But it's not a holiday from war, and she wears a sweatshirt that says Superwoman, and she genuinely is one. She wants to be able to buy jeans, but she doesn't know whether the shops will be open, whether the small shop she's gone to today will be open between 12 and 3. So she has launched Operation Jeans because she just wants to have a spare pair of trousers to wear. And she's established her regular no makeup war look, and she posts photographs of it. And I want to imagine what that would be like for each and every one of us coming into this chamber with no makeup. It's why I referenced cosmetic procedures and the British Beauty Council earlier, because we take all that for granted. And if we were her, we might have to accept that for the foreseeable future, everything looked different and our faces looked different. And she talks of this life and that life. This life is the present, her reality. That life was what she had before: freedom, her coffee with friends, her jeans, her lipstick, her life in Kyiv. So whilst we celebrate International Women's Day here, we have to recognise that just as Yaroslava has a this and a that life, there is a life here and a life there. Here there are no bombs, there are jeans in the shops, and we can drink coffee whenever we want. And there is a there where there are none of those things. And there are little girls in bomb shelters singing the song from Frozen, and female doctors dodging bombs to treat the sick, and female MPs staying defiantly in Kyiv, in their capital. And there's a former Miss Ukraine who is brandishing her assault weapon and is in army uniform. And there are women on the borders of Ukraine with their children, having left their husbands, their fathers, their sons behind to fight. So on International Women's Day this year, I can't celebrate, but I have to have hope that as the women of influence in this country, we can make sure that we do better.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's now 2 years since I delivered my maiden speech in Parliament during a similar debate on International Women's Day, in which I paid tribute to our local history of women's struggle for social justice, which continues to be a daily source of inspiration. To quote the amazing Greta Thunberg, International Women's Day is for protesting against and raising awareness about the fact that people are still being oppressed or treated differently because of their gender. And Madam Deputy Speaker, we still do have so much to protest against. Today's debate comes at as the cost of living crisis is fostering a sense of injustice, uncertainty and anxiety across the UK, set against the brutal backdrop of the pandemic and a decade of Conservative austerity. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic has meant that women have been more likely than men to lose their jobs or reduce their paid work, given that they are more frequently employed in sectors that have been directly disrupted by lockdown and social distancing measures. Women, particularly Black, Asian and minority ethnic women, continue to account for around 2/3 of low earners and are more likely to be working on zero-hour or part-time contracts. The increased overlap of working and caring responsibilities has added to the ongoing reality that caring continues to be a major factor in women's ability to participate on equal terms. To put it simply, Mr. Deputy Speaker, women still face structural economic inequality throughout their lives, and this intersects with other structures of inequality, including race and disability. We also know that violence against women, including trans women, continues to blight our society. Women die and are dying every day, while support services continue to be cut. Now, I know personally that the impact of domestic abuse on the mental health of survivors can be truly devastating. Yet there continue to be many barriers and many challenges facing survivors when they are trying to access help. We know that ethnic minority survivors of domestic abuse suffer for 1.5 times longer before seeking help, and as such, we urgently need funding for services, in particular specialist community services and specialist refuges. As the chair of the APPG on domestic abuse and violence, I am delighted to be working with Women's Aid and others on their campaign Deserve to be Heard, and to argue for domestic abuse to be recognised as a public health priority. Yet whilst the government invariably uses the language of protecting women, their programme of austerity, real terms cuts to benefits and pensions, and assaults on civil liberties explicitly targets those of us most at risk: migrants, Black, Asian and minority ethnic women, and Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities. The cruel no-recourse to public funds condition prevents women from accessing help when most at need. And the hostile and racist immigration system tightens around women facing deportation, imprisons women in unacceptable conditions, and even sees women drown at sea when they try to seek safety. And I plead with the government today, please scrap the inhumane Nationality and Borders Bill, which risks criminalising refugees, including Ukrainian refugees, who arrive in the UK through an irregular route, and instead ensure that there are always safe routes for those seeking sanctuary and asylum. Too often, under this government, the very institutions that are meant to be there to protect us are in fact failing us over and over again. And women are being told that we must forget that only a year ago, Sarah Everard was killed by a serving police officer. We're expected to ignore that there is clearly a problem within the police regarding racism and misogyny that needs to be urgently addressed. And structural racism itself has long been identified in the police, with the Lamy Review of 2017 finding that arrest rates are twice as high for ethnic minority women as compared with white women. And this has been found to lead to an increased distrust of the official support services in the ethnic minority communities, leading ethnic minority women to be less likely to report experiences of violence and receive support. So yes, Mr Deputy Speaker, International Women's Day must be about highlighting these ongoing injustices. But more than this, I think it is about pointing the way to overcome such wrongs. Now, whilst International Women's Day has historical association in recognising women's oppression and exploitation, it is also a time when we have highlighted the victories which have been won. Whether that's standing up against violence and austerity, or struggling for better working conditions, or demanding equal pay, women have always played a vitally important role in the struggle for social justice, rallying, organising, protesting and inspiring millions of us and winning against the odds. From the industrial action by the matchworkers at the Bryanton May factory in 1888, or the historic strike action by female sewing machinists at the Dagenham Ford Motor Company in 1968, or Jaiban Desai leading a walkout at the Brunswick Film Processing Laboratories in 1976, or Southall Black Sisters being on the forefront of challenging domestic and gender-related violence locally and nationally for decades. So yes, today is about inspiring us to overcome, and there is lots to inspire us. And that's why I want to finish, Mr Deputy Speaker, by highlighting the victories secured by Unite the Union members working for Barts NHS Trust this month, after strike action in which Black, Asian and minority ethnic women in particular played a crucial role. I applaud their bravery and their determination in fighting exploitation, standing together day in, day out, in the cold and in the rain, demanding that change that they deserved. And this landmark win sends a message to all that pay gaps and low pay are utterly unacceptable. It shows how to challenge injustice and inequality. And the message is clearer than ever before. A woman's place is in the political struggle, in her union, and yes, on the picket lines. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Sir Lynn Saxby.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I am number 529, the 529th woman to be sworn into this great Parliament, of only 559 women ever sworn into this place. The statistics, whilst improving, still have a way to go. We are ranked as the 45th country in the world for the proportion of women in Parliament. Only 36% of our councillors are women, and it is against this backdrop that I was delighted this International Women's Day to join, unfortunately by Zoom, a meeting of businesswomen back home at the launch of Women in Business North Devon, many of whom are interested in stepping into public life. The event was organised by the fabulous Roshni Mahajan, Sales and Marketing Director of Aramis Rugby, a British sports manufacturing brand supplying top-flight rugby teams in the UK and abroad. Roshni is just one of the great examples of women in leadership roles we have in North Devon. From our business leaders like Kate Cox, CEO of Bray Leno, one of the largest digital marketing businesses in the UK outside of London, Paula Byers, founder and director of LimeCloud Limited and chair of Digital North Devon, as well as being on multiple steering committees like Tech South West. We have leaders in the social sector, like Sue Wallace, chief executive of the vital North Devon Against Domestic Abuse, and Rosie Bratcher, a leading lawyer specialising in complex child and family matters, as well as Michaela Willis, who came out of retirement during the first lockdown and set up the National Bereavement Partnership, which has worked tirelessly ever since, providing a support helpline, counselling referral and befriending services for all those suffering from bereavement, grief, living loss, mental health issues and affected by the global COVID-19 pandemic. Plus the amazing Suzanne Tracy, leading the North Devon Healthcare Trust and the Royal Devon and Exeter through a crucial integration of the trusts and investment in our healthcare system. I very much hope, highlighting these women, many of whom will be unknown in their local community, that their achievements may encourage others to step up, undeterred from whatever they may believe is holding them back. And my apologies to the other brilliant women in North Devon that are not in my speech today. As women, we are wired a bit differently. We often think things through so far, we have talked ourselves out of them before we have even considered that we could do them. And in my mind, it is no wonder, as still there are pockets of resistance that we need to tackle, something as fundamental as violence against women and girls. The Honourable Member for Yardley will no doubt jerk tears as she recalls those so tragically taken from this life by men around them. And yet I received this letter from a constituent in a position of authority on the one-year anniversary of the dreadful murder of Sarah Everard about the, in his words, extensive media coverage of the Home Secretary's statement on the government's directive to the police about keeping women and girls safe in public places, and government money being supplied for that purpose. Of course, it is important that women and girls are kept safe, but this programme shows discrimination of the worst kind, in that young men and boys who suffer 3 times the number of murders and over 4 times the number of violent attacks are totally excluded. It has been compared to a campaign to keep white people safe that excludes people of colour. And it has been brought about by well-organised campaigns by feminist extremists who see females as being superior to males, even under the law. I know myself that misogyny is alive and well in North Devon, from the comments thrown or even shouted at me as MP, and have also taken steps to ensure when that has crossed from what might be considered banter to become abuse, that they have seen the full force of the law. And I hope that other women will follow my lead and call out what is simply unacceptable. And I look forward to working with our fabulous Police and Crime Commissioner, Alison Hernandez, as we work towards securing safer streets in North Devon. We all know, as women here, the abuse comes with the territory. And as I explained to the women on the business call this week, thinking about stepping into public life, it is bad on social media as an MP, and somewhat less so as a councillor. But we know as women we are stronger when we work together, and the support we all give to each other here when dealing with these matters. And I hope it never deters more women in North Devon stepping into public life. I may be the first female MP for North Devon, but I very much hope I'm not the last. This International Women's Day is particularly poignant, given the situation in Ukraine with today's horrific scenes, women and children leaving husbands, fathers, sons behind to fight, whilst many Ukrainian women have done so much and even taken up arms themselves. In a week where we have heard the President of Ukraine quote Churchill, walking down Whitehall and seeing the statue remembering the contribution of 7 million women in World War II has taken on a whole new significance, with so many inspiring women on the front line in Ukraine. Slava Ukraini, we all stand with Ukraine. This year's International Women's Day theme is Break the Bias, which their own website describes as working towards a gender-equal world, a world free of bias, stereotypes and discrimination, a world that's diverse, equitable and inclusive, a world where difference is valued and celebrated. Together we can forge women's equality. Collectively, we can all break the bias.
Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. First, I must start by thanking the Speaker's Office for their understanding every year in making time for me to read these names, and to the Right Honourable Member for Basingstoke for always calling this debate. This year in the gallery we are joined by Carol and Matt Gould and their son Zeb, and by Julie Davey. They are the families of Ellie Gould and Poppy Davey Waterhouse, whose names I have read out on previous years, both brutally killed and taken from their families. The act of remembrance that we undertake here every year is completely down to the work of Karen Ingala Smith and the Counting Dead Women project. She's the only person keeping this data, but her painstaking work over many years has meant that, unlike 7 years ago when I first read this list, we are all more aware of the peril of femicide. This wasn't the government's doing, it wasn't them doing the work, it was women. Women giving their labour away for free. This week I invited the families of the women I have listed over the years to come here to Parliament. Myself and the Labour Party will be working with them to build up a family's manifesto for change. Each one of them had stories to tell about their daughters being murdered, or their perpetrators were on bail, or how their mother's killer only went away for 6 years because he had taken drugs before he killed her, or the killings that went uninvestigated because the woman had taken drugs. Today we live in a society where the excuse a perpetrator who kills uses to get a lighter sentence when applied to a woman who has been killed is used to victim blame and diminish her innocence in the trial of her own death. Every name I am about to read, there will be a story about how better mental health services, even the slightest suggestion of offender management, or the availability of quick specialist victim support would have saved their lives. The perpetrators killed, but it is on us in here if we keep allowing a system where women live under the requirement to give away their labour for free in the pursuit of their own safety. The final name on the list last year when I stood here was a name that we all know. Here are the names of the women killed since that supposedly watershed moment. Karen McLean, Stacey Nell, Smita Mistry, Samantha Mills, Diane Mansfield, Patricia Audsley, Phyllis Nelson, Claudia Soltis, Simone Ambler, Emma MacArthur, Sherry Teresa Milnes, Constanta Bunea, Jacqueline Grant, Loretta Herman, Sally Metcalf, Sarah Keith, Peggy Wright, Charmaine O'Donnell, Michelle Cooper, Kerry Bradford, Julia James, Beth Aspey, Susan Booth, Maya Zulfikar, Maria Rawlings, Shanice Gregory, Agnes Acom, Wendy Cole, Caroline Crouch, Svetlana Mihalaki, Nicola Kirk, an unnamed woman, Ajita Jasleru, Alison Stevenson, Lauren Wilson, Penina Kabeba, Jill Hickory, Bethany Vincent, killed alongside her 9-year-old son, Leah Ware, Esther Brown, Michaela Hall, Mildred Whitmore, Stacey Clay, Linda Hood, Marlene Coleman, Sophie Cartledge, Gracie Spinks, Kim Dearden, Michelle Hibbert, killed alongside her husband, Sally Poynton, Catherine Waddleworth, Sukhjit Bandial, Elsie Pinder, Catherine Stewart, Ishrat Ahmed, Tamara Paddy, Katie Brankin, Sandra C, Beatrice Senusa, Patricia Holland, Louise Cam, Jordanes Brahane, Amanda Selby, Malgorzata Leshasanka, Megan Nubra, Diana Nichols, Maxine Davison, Katie Shepherd, Bella Nicandro, Eileen Barrett, Sharon Pickles, Helen Anderson, Jade Ward, Maddie Durdant Hollamby, Fawzia Javed, Ingrid Matthew, another unnamed woman, Sabina Nessa, Terry Harris, killed alongside her 2 children, John Bennett and Lacey Bennett, and Lacey's friend who was there for a sleepover, Connie Gent. Sukhjit Uppal, Norma Girolami, Jakuki Jabbo, Nicole Hurley, Bonnie Harwood, Katrina Rainey, Marta Chipmalenka, Ruth Dent, Josephine Smith, Dawn Walker, Yvonne Barr, Sarah Ashwell, Tambi Dowling, Pauline Quinn, Ilona Golobeck, Alexandra Morgan, Tricia Livesey and her partner Anthony Tipping, Bobby Ann MacLeod, Borry Benko, Jennifer Chappell and her husband Stephen, June Fox Roberts, Malak Adabazada, Fernanda, Amber Gibson, Lily Sullivan, Camille Morgan, Julia Howes, Beverly Taylor and John Taylor, Mary Fell and husband, Kirsty Ashley, Brenda Blaney, Judith Armstrong, Frida Walker, Marlene Doyle, Yasmin Chikafi, Lucy Powell, who was my constituent, killed at the age of 21, Marina Shaban, Lesma Jackson, Ashley Wadsworth, Carissa Brown, Katie Harris, Nicola Shaba, Dawn Tresler, Valerie Warrington, alongside her husband. I also want to mention the names of 4 other women, 3 women who have been killed in the last month, where no suspect has yet been charged. They are Claire Applewhite, Valerie Free, and Naomi Hunt. And finally, to mention a mention for Joma Girare, whose body was dumped and set on fire in a lay-by last August, and nobody has been charged with her murder. Many women like Joma don't appear on our lists because no one is ever charged with their killing, or because they die by staged homicide in sudden death, falling from a building, overdose or suicide, and we never look into the history of domestic abuse in their cases. The list is painfully long, but in reality, the list is much longer. We can make it shorter. Let's act faster.
Caroline Ansell.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I think the quality of the silence that accompanied the reading out of those names is always very moving and really does compel us to change. And I commend the Honourable Lady for her work.
Yeah.
And I congratulate my Right Honourable friend also on opening today and on leading in this very important issue. Because sadly, we need to keep leading, we need to keep following, and we need to keep working to change the world. And I think seeing the televised images of the bombing of a maternity hospital speaks of such unimaginable evil that it must surely compel the world to see things differently. And I'm very pleased to speak today as the 448th woman in Parliament. I did endeavour to find from the House of Commons Library the number of men elected thus far, just so we can see just how much ground we need to cover to begin to catch up. But that figure is still being sought. But I'm very pleased today, nonetheless, at 448. And I echo very much the Honourable Lady in paying tribute to my mum, who was born into poverty in the 1930s Glasgow, who outperformed her start in life by dint of her fierce personality and changed the world for me, and is my staunchest supporter too. And I'd like today to pay tribute to some of the amazing women in my constituency who all in their own way are showing a better world and inspiring younger women to take their place. I'm going to speak a little about the political scene, because whilst I see women excelling and coming forward in strong numbers across all sorts of different sectors, not least during this pandemic, when sitting behind that amazing Pfizer success and the AstraZeneca success, women were very much leading the way there. Still, that issue around role models exists. And in politics, how difficult it is to inspire other women sometimes to stand. And I think the comments from my honourable friend, the member for North Devon, really underpin why that has become so difficult a challenge. A few years ago, in my first term, I experienced a death threat and court case, and women in my constituency have seen and see still what I go through. I'm facing exactly the same situation again. And I reach out to them because their contribution to local government could be immense. They bring in tremendous experience and insight. They would be a power of good. And can I persuade them to stand? No. Even though we have really powerful role models, there is work to be done there, and I welcome the work around the Online Harms Bill, which I know will start to make a real difference in that sphere. Until then, it's for women to show the way. And I met recently Dr. Amal, who was the first speaker in the United Arab Emirates, and indeed the first speaker in the Arab world. What an incredible role model she is. Her dignity, her grace, her courage. She is truly world-changing. And interestingly, she said that in terms of her own position and her contribution, she paid tribute, and I would like to echo that too. She paid tribute to the men in her life. She paid tribute to her husband and her father and her sons, who have been her staunchest supporters. And she said, and I think there's some relevance here today, she said behind many good women, there are often good men. And I offer up my colleagues today in that spirit, because whilst women are showing a strong lead, we all need to move together, and it will take all of us to do that. So in terms of those women in my constituency who all have been honoured in this last year, I want to first raise Dorrit Oliver-Woolf, octogenarian now, but unstoppable, a Holocaust survivor who has dedicated all her years to education and to reaching younger generations, to inspire in them a message around how they can play their part in making the world a better place. And she speaks even yet and led on our Holocaust Memorial Day event. She's a published author, was a pop star in younger years, and her defiance and her commitment to this better world is just unparalleled. I'd also like to profile Laura Murphy at the Wayfinder Women Trust. Run by women, for women, they help those who are feeling anxious and uncertain about themselves and their future. They build their self-confidence and their skills, and they enable them to challenge the barriers that are facing them and to break the bias. And they have been hugely impactful for women right across my constituency and beyond. I'd also like to raise award winners Lucy Button Holland Preston, who launched Bramber Bakehouse, again awarded this year. Bramber, a very nice connection for us here in Parliament, was the constituency of William Wilberforce, one of my personal heroes, for his work, of course, around slavery. And they provide baking, well-being and employability programs for female survivors of human trafficking, equipping and empowering them. With women such as these leading in all sorts of ways, I just feel confident that the world can be a better place. Eastbourne is a better place for their work, and I think today we'll hear more and more examples of how women are really taking that lead, making the difference, and we wish them all every success.
Yeah. Rosie Duffield.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. This is the 5th International Women's Day debate since I was elected in 2017. The 5th time I've sat here to listen to my friend, the member for Birmingham Yardley, read out the names of women killed in the last year, and the 7th time she has read that horrific list compiled by our friend Karen Ngala Smith as part of her Counting Dead Women project. This year's list is even longer than the last, but with several cases yet unsolved and many yet to go through court, this vile list and those grim statistics are sadly only going to increase. It seems that those 125 men clearly haven't been listening, clearly didn't hear as women around the world said enough, didn't see or hear those women at the vigils for Sarah, and weren't listening as we debated in this place and spoke about women's rage and pain and what it's like to live in fear. We can add these men to the many whose victims were included in the work of artist Wilma Wolf, who visited Parliament this week. Her decorated dinner plates show women killed by men, listed by year, and with a symbol to indicate how they met their deaths. Those symbols show a grim range of causes, from strangulation to being burnt, poisoned, drowned, shot, pushed from a balcony, decapitated, and so on. Wilma says of her work, made in conjunction with the Femicide Census, that it is designed to remember the women who have needlessly lost their lives and also to highlight the institutionalised and systemic acceptance of this human rights abuse, which is often regarded as an inevitable part of men and women coexisting. The Femicide Census states, there is little suggestion that any intervention over the past 10 years has had a significant impact or even any impact at all on the number of women being killed by men. This, then, is surely now an absolute emergency. In the last couple of weeks alone, we've talked about this crisis, violence against women and girls, violence, rape, murder, whether at home or in a war zone. Violence affecting 51% of the population, women who work, women who vote, women watching as we fail to do anything at all to reduce these horrific statistics. Certainly.
Does she agree that there are some walks of life, for example, the armed forces, where women face even greater barriers to receiving support for domestic violence or harassment? And would she agree that the government should be working to ensure there's parity so that the right support is offered to all women?
Thank you very much for the member's points, and I absolutely agree. What do women have to do? Collectively go on strike, stand still, lay down, leave our workplaces, our homes, stand in the road, the motorway, silently disengaging with the systems and society that refuse to see or hear our rage? This is not a political hot potato. It's about society, Our representatives here have to lead, change, demand change and show change. It's our duty. Men need to know that without question or exception, this will not be tolerated. That nothing at all awaits them if they hurt or kill women apart from a prison cell. Families of victims visited us here this week, again thanks to the heroic member for Birmingham Yardley. Their pain at the loss of their loved ones, made worse by layers of injustice, keeping those wounds as raw as when they first heard that devastating news. Injustices that would shock most people, such as the killer of their daughter, sister or mother, still having control of her money or access to her children. The fact that he raped her not being included in the charge sheet or factored into the sentencing decision. We have to do better, and this all has to change urgently. Drastic action, changes to our courts, police, legal systems, whatever it takes. We should be demanding this on behalf of women in the UK, and I'm demanding this as someone whose name could once have been read out by my honourable friend. Let's show that we are listening and making these lists shorter every year. Next International Women's Day, I pray that we are not having to be as angry, that we are celebrating change and hope, and above all, freedom for the incredibly brave women of Ukraine.
Katina.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'd like to congratulate the Right Honourable Member for Basingstoke for bringing forward this important debate. As ever, it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Canterbury and the many members who've spoken so movingly about the women in Ukraine and also women facing the most severe violence in this country. In the spirit of this year's theme, Break the Bias, I want to focus my remarks on girls and women in science, maths and tech careers, and I want to start by telling two stories. Born in 1815, Ada Lovelace was the child of poet Lord Byron and mathematician Lady Byron, who had a passion for mathematics from an early age, and despite childhood illness, Ada let nothing hold her back. Aged 12, she decided she wanted to fly. She examined the anatomy of birds and explored the best materials to create herself a set of wings. As a teenager, at just 18, she was working with mathematician Charles Babbage on one of the very first computers, almost 200 years ago. And despite later marrying and becoming a countess, she did not give up her passion for a life of leisure, and her work on the analytical engine means she's widely recognised as one of the world's first computer programmers. A half a century after Ada was born, Agnes Pockels was born in Germany. She couldn't study at university like her brother because women weren't allowed to at the time, and she had sick parents at home and therefore a lot of caring responsibilities. Stuck at home, carrying out all the household chores that I'm sure we will all recognise, Agnes noticed soap building on the surface of her washing water. Aged 18, she began conducting experiments at home to understand more. And although she was locked out of accessing scientific literature, this did not stop Agnes. In 1891, she published her first scientific paper, Surface Tension, and she's now recognised as a pioneer in the field of surface science. If we ask ourselves why we are here today, it's because women have historically been disenfranchised, disempowered, and devoiced. I would happily give way to them.
Because she is just bringing to our attention a very interesting woman who has made lots of scientific process. And I just wanted to make sure that she knows about Caroline Herschel. Together with her brother, she was an astronomer. And actually, she did more work than him, but her work wasn't recognized. So does she agree we need to sing the praises of those women from the past as much as possible?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention. I completely agree. There are so many we could mention today. Rosalind Franklin, there are so many whose work was not properly recognised at the time and we should recognise now. But women have been shut out of the room where decisions are made and locked out of the jobs with highest returns. So I'm glad that we today can celebrate much progress since the time of Ada and the time of Agnes. But the fact is, women are still playing catch-up after centuries and centuries of inequality. PhD, computer and data scientists are powering the economy, creating new billion-dollar companies in life sciences, AI, fintech, health tech and beyond. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, three of the richest people on the planet, all STEM students. and now leaders of companies that are shaping the world around us with arguably more power and certainly more wealth than our political leaders. In the years ahead, Wall Street, the new Wall Street, is going to be a wet lab. We know STEM subjects are some of the highest value-added courses for future earnings. We also know that demand is surging for people to fill these new high-quality tech and data science jobs. This field is now where the decisions are being taken and where those high-return jobs are being created. And I want women to get their fair slice of the economic pie so that we are not playing catch-up in the decades to come. Since 2010, under successive Conservative governments, the number of women accepted on full-time STEM undergraduate courses in the UK has increased by almost 50%. But women still remain deeply unrepresented in STEM subjects. Girls are only half as likely as boys to say their strongest subject is science or maths, despite the fact that we know that they now regularly outperform in these subjects. A Girl Guide survey last year showed over half of 11 to 21-year-old girls and women said that they felt that STEM subjects were more for the boys. Only 14.5% of engineers are women, and only 13% of STEM workers at management level are women. This is bias at work, and for the future of equality in this country, we need to break it. There could not be a better time, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The success of the COVID vaccine rollout is an inspiration to so many young women in this country who want to be the next Kate Bingham, or Professor Sarah Gilbert, or Emily Lawson, or perhaps the next Ada Lovelace and Agnes Pockles. Luckily today we do live in an open society where women can access the world of academia, science and enterprise. However, we are still fighting centuries of bias. That's why I'm delighted to be working with our fantastic Children's Commissioner, Dame Rachel de Souza, to encourage more women, particularly into advanced mathematical courses. And we'll be hosting a roundtable later this month. If any fellow members are interested, please do get in touch. It is of the utmost importance to ensure in the centuries ahead that women are not playing catch-up once again.
Aaron Fellows.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it's always a privilege to speak in this debate. And I thank the Honourable Member for Basingstoke for bringing it forward year on year. Mr. Deputy Speaker, despite the great progress made by women that have come before us, women today are still subject to huge economic, social and political inequalities right across the world. Intersectional inequalities in particular should be highlighted here today. And in their 2020 report and recommendations to the First Minister's National Advisory Council on Women and Girls, they defined intersectionality as a framework for understanding how multiple categories of identity, such as gender, race and class, interact in ways that create complex systems in terms of oppression and power. How must it feel to be a woman who is disabled, who is of colour, in the world today, even here in the UK? And we know that disabled women are often disproportionately impacted by many of the inequalities that folk experience here. The Glasgow Disability Alliance, for example, which is based in Glasgow, has spoken of the triple whammy facing disabled women today, from being disabled, being a woman and dealing with the impact of COVID-19. And here's a fact: an estimated 19% of women over 18 years old have a disability, compared to 12% of men. Astonishing and difficult to comprehend. Women, and disabled women in particular, face great bias and disadvantage in the workplace. Measures such as the right to call for flexible working from the start of employment would benefit these people and benefit women generally in particular, because women, and let's be honest here, have a hugely disproportionate share of caring responsibilities, making it difficult for some of them to maintain or even to take on work. Women are also more likely to miss out on things like statutory sick pay. The UK, as we all know, has one of the lowest sick pay rates in the OECD, and this means that many women are not eligible for it, even women on maternity pay. So this might be a good place and a good time to call on an urgent overhaul of the wholly inadequate statutory sick pay system. Crucial and long-awaited reforms to employment law are needed to keep caregivers, mainly women, and disabled women in the workplace and ensure that they get the support they need to stay in work should they choose to do so. Disabled women are also disproportionately impacted by gender-based violence, and I thank the Honourable Member for Yardley. I don't want to thank you. I want you not to have to do this year on year. But we know that domestic violence and abuse are often underreported, and the World Health Organization has estimated that around a third of women globally will be subject to physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. In the 2017, the UN cited research estimating that, again, disabled women experience domestic violence at twice the rate of other women and experience violence specifically because of their disability. This has to stop. In Scotland, there's a programme called Equally Safe, which is our strategy for preventing and eradicating violence against women and girls, focused on the need for prevention of violence. We need to make their priorities, which are achieving greater gender equality, intervening early and effectively, and tackling perpetrators, something that happens as a matter of course right across the UK. We must continue to press for legislation to tackle gender-based violence, especially women. Because it does happen to men, and we shouldn't ever forget that as well. Today, we all are thinking of Ukraine, and we are showing solidarity with women in Ukraine, and how many of us will ever forget the sight of a pregnant woman being stretchered out of a hospital. This has to stop, and there are so many things that we can do. And I'm going to make a personal plea here to the Minister. I know it's not your responsibility, but we can't have people sitting at borders waiting to get across. We have all acknowledged that the majority of refugees in Ukraine are women and girls. We've seen the pictures of women and girls at borders saying farewell to the men who go back to fight. We shouldn't be making people wait to get here. We need also, and I would call for the Article 11 of the UN CRPD, which is the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, to be taken into account as part of someone's refugee status and to help them to get in here sooner. I'm going to change, and I'm just going to say in conclusion, all of us in here, especially the women, have often been asked to give advice to young women who are wanting to come into public life. I've been asked, and I had to think about, how did I get started? Well, I got started because a man stood down as a branch convener and nobody else would do it, and I thought, oh, here I go. And I put myself forward because I had been badly treated in a previous employment. And the way I did it was I had to think of myself putting on a hat. You know, this hat would be a different Marion, different person who could say and do things that normally I wouldn't be able to do. And I've given that advice to young women. But what I'd really like to be able to do is say, ditch the hat, just cut the bias. Let's do it on equal terms without having to build ourselves up to do it instead. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Lady for Motherwell for that inspiring close to her speech. Not to disabuse her in any way, but I think you'll find that quite a lot of men do quite a lot of pretending too. We may cover it up better, but she gives the right advice. It's everyone is better if they're just themselves, and if we feel empowered to be ourselves. And this should be a debate about where we celebrate the re-empowerment of women. I say re-empower because there is now some evidence which suggests that in prehistoric societies, women were not disempowered or subjected to male patriarchy. But recent progress is being thrown into reverse, not just by terrible wars and the terrible list that the Honourable Lady for Yardley reads out every year, but in particular the rights of women to women-only safe spaces is threatened, to safe spaces like public toilets, women's hospital wards and women's prisons. All violence against women is nearly all committed by men, but there is a new and growing category of violence against women committed by people who call themselves women but are biologically male. We should always respond positively to people with genuine gender dysphoria, and I deliver this speech with kindness in my heart. But the 2003 Sexual Offences Act defines rape as when a person, and I quote from the Act, a person intentionally penetrates the vagina, anus or mouth of another person with his penis without consent. Now, between 2012 and 2018, the Crown Prosecution Service reports over 436 cases of rape recorded as committed by women. The penis is a male organ, so these rapes are committed by men presenting themselves as women. Bastions of feminism, and I hear one on the other side of the House, who highlight this risk, and others like Germaine Greer, Professor Kathleen Stock, Professor Joe Phoenix, journalists like Suzanne Moore, are bullied online and even hounded out of their jobs because they talk about this. But we as legislators, we must be clear and courageous about what a man is and what a woman is. Today's interim report from the Independent Review of Gender Identity Services for Children and Young People by Dr. Hilary Cass notes the rapid increase in the number of adolescent girls presenting with gender distress. It says, and I quote, "At present we have the least information for the largest group of patients, birth-registered females first presenting in early teen years." Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is essential we understand why we are witnessing this historically unprecedented number of young girls who are finding puberty so difficult to navigate. And our own government's proposed conversion therapy bill must therefore be reviewed in the light of this, and we must wait until the full report comes out before we present this bill for second reading. It is a scientific fact that our biological sex is immutable. As Professor Lord Winston said on BBC Question Time, and I quote, "I will say this categorically, that you cannot change your sex. Your sex actually is there in every single cell in your body." The responsibility for clarity, therefore, starts with us as legislators. We have to be clear about what words mean in our legislation, and astonishingly, some of us are reluctant to be clear. A woman is an adult female human. Only this week, the Honourable Lady for Oxford East, who is in her place, was asked to define a woman on the media, and she was unable or unwilling to give a clear answer. Of course, I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I would like to ask the Honourable Member for evidence of the statement he has just made. I would like him to provide a transcript of my comments, any quote he can find from anywhere that would indicate that at any point I have not been clear about what a woman is. It's quite easy for me, given that I am a woman.
Furnish myself with a quote, but I'm very happy to write to the Honourable Lady. But I can promise the Honourable Lady that she did not answer the question when she was asked. And, OK, I give way again.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm afraid the Honourable Member appears perhaps not to have followed the evidence about what I have stated. Perhaps he may have consulted social media rather than looking at what I stated. I hope he will withdraw the comment he just made. Thank you.
If I have misled the House by misrepresenting the Honourable Lady, I absolutely apologise for doing so.
Give way?
I will give way to my honourable friend in a moment, but I will check the facts, and I will set the record straight if it is necessary for me to do so. I give way to my honourable friend.
So I've just looked up the quote from the honourable lady, and it might well be that she can clarify this because she was trying to explain the Labour Party's official definition, but she was asked what her definition of a woman is, and she said that, with respect, it does depend what the context is, surely. So she wasn't giving a clear personal definition, but perhaps she's able to now.
I will give way to her if she will give a clear definition of...
This has been a really well-natured debate, and it might be useful if we just move on.
Speaker, there have been others representing the opposition front bench who have said things like, oh, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. And indeed, the Right Honourable Leader of the Opposition said on Mar that the phrase, only women have a cervix, and I quote, he said, is something that shouldn't be said. It is not right, unquote. This is a strange way to stand up for women's rights. The government must reply to this debate with clear definitions of man and woman, as enshrined in the Equality Act 2010. It must commit to preventing biological men, whatever identity they claim, and with whatever sincerity they claim that identity, from gaining access to women-only safe spaces. If not, the government is failing to protect women. I will give way to the Honourable Lady again.
Thank you. I'm grateful to the Deputy Speaker. Is the Right Honourable Member aware that I in fact referred in my remarks to the Equality Act, which makes that provision for single-sex spaces, that I have done so repeatedly? It appears that he was not aware of that. I have no problem with criticism when it's on the basis of what I have done, but I do, with respect, have a problem with criticism on the basis of things I have not done, particularly, if I may say, during this debate. Thank you.
Talking about the Honourable Lady at that particular point, but she's put on record what she feels, and maybe when she sums up the debate, what she said, okay, but maybe when she replies to this debate, she will give us a definition of what she thinks a woman is. The government must also challenge the Scottish Parliament via its proposed gender recognition reform bill, because it intends to endow new controversial rights on all UK citizens which have not been approved by this Parliament, and that was never the intention of the devolution settlement. Anyone from any part of the UK would be able to acquire a gender recognition certificate in Scotland with no medical diagnosis. So they could change the sex on their birth certificate and so gain the rights to women-only safe spaces. This is completely unacceptable.
Will my Right Honourable friend give way?
I give way to my Honourable friend.
Can I thank my Right Honourable friend for giving way, and I absolutely respect his right to make the speech that he's making. But he refers to safety in women-only spaces. Can he be clear in his remarks that for the past more than 10 years under the Equality Act, organisations like Women Aid and Refuge have been making sure those spaces are absolutely safe by using risk assessments on everybody who uses them, whether they're men or women or indeed trans people who may be trans. And so this issue, whilst important, is already being practically dealt with by organisations.
Well, I'm afraid I think a great many women do not agree with her, and I'm speaking for them. And I think I'm most grateful.
Just following on from that next point, will you agree with me that there has been some confusion in the past about the extent to which single-sex services can be provided under the Equality Act, and the updated guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is planned, would be very welcome?
For that intervention, and I note what she says. The SNP Minister, Shoni Robinson, said when she was introducing the bill, and I quote, "There is no evidence that predatory men have ever had to pretend to be anything else to carry out predatory behaviour." I'm afraid this comment really misses the point. The point is that it does create new opportunities for predatory men, and I'm afraid my right honourable friend has to accept that there are plenty of instances where biological men have taken advantage of this new freedom granted to them to the detriment and safety of women. Women are taking flight from the political parties. I'm going to draw my remarks to a close, but I will give way.
Yes, just to clarify, because there are some predatory men who always will find loopholes for violence, is that a reason for not protecting the most vulnerable communities in our that we have, and that's the transgender community?
It's not the most vulnerable community.
I don't follow what the Honourable Lady says. I'm in favour of protecting the trans community in this country. What I'm not in favour of is allowing biological men into women's spaces where they can threaten women as a matter of right. However, risk assess. I don't know how you risk assess somebody going into a public toilet. I don't know how you risk assess somebody going into other women's only safe spaces. The fact is that women are taking flight from the political parties that are supporting this kind of agenda, and at least the Conservative Party can be a safe haven for them if we stand up and speak for women.
Osborne. Right.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I would say that it's a pleasure to follow the member for Harwich and North Essex, but actually it isn't. It's unfortunate, it's a real pity that the member took today to make his views known to us, and which I found most unhelpful and out of step with today's debate, and a real pity that he doesn't use the opportunity to celebrate women and rather than take more time than any other woman has done today to make his speech. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd like to start my contribution reflecting on the shared and collective experiences of working class women in the Jarrow constituency over the last 90 years. Whilst this country recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm reminded of the history of struggle my Jarrow constituency has faced in the past, how despite being generations apart, the struggles of unemployment in the 1930s are difficult to separate from the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. And importantly and relevant to this debate is how both of these struggles have predominantly impacted working class women. For women in my constituency, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought back economic and social circumstances that wouldn't look out of place in the 1930s. Throughout the 1930s, it was women who suffered socially as a result of endemic unemployment. It was they who had to face the landlord, the butcher and the greengrocer as they had to manage a home on a significantly lower income. 19 years later, through the coronavirus pandemic, when I look at the livelihoods of some of my constituency, with the withdrawal of vital support and with rising food and energy prices, it feels like history is beginning to repeat itself. During the pandemic, support schemes such as the Job Retention Scheme and the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme overlooked existing inequalities women face in the labour market. A time where women took on the majority of homeschooling and childcare, regardless of whether they were in paid employment or not. The ONS reported that since the start of and at every point during the pandemic, women reported significantly higher anxiety than men, with women being 1.3 times lonelier. And an IPPR report from April 2021 shockingly reported that there has been a 62% increase in the number of women disclosing that they had experienced sexual violence in the first 4 months of the pandemic. And in the North East alone, there was a 179% increase in reports from women of abuse. When society grappled with the issues faced by 1930s unemployment, which peaked in Jarrow at 80%, the national government targeted the poor through the means test. When this country faced the unprecedented economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, this Tory government made the political choice to withdraw the £20 increase to universal credit. All of these actions have one common denominator, past and present. For the people in my constituency, these actions have had a disproportionate effect on working class and marginalised women. As we rightly reflect on the great successes and battles that have been won by generations gone by in the fight for women and girls' rights, I'd like to remind the House how critical it is, as we mark International Women's Day, that we remember the responsibility we have in this House in how our actions here impact on all women in our constituencies and the battle that was had to get women into this place. On this, the great late socialist Ellen Wilkinson said, "Women have worked hard, starved in prison, given of their time and lives that we might sit in the House of Commons and take part in the legislating of this country." In my local area, I would like to personally say how fantastic I think it is that we have, as the leader, the deputy leader of South Tyneside Local Authority, my constituency neighbour, the member for South Shields, and the local police and crime commissioner, all positions represented by women. I was proud to stand on the Labour 2019 manifesto, which sought to address some of the imbalances in our society, which I referenced earlier in my speech. In particular, the commitments to close the gender pay gap by 2030, the demand that all workplaces have a menopause policy, and that survivors of domestic abuse will be entitled to 10 days of paid leave. Much needed policies that have unfortunately been largely ignored and faded away as we enter the current post-pandemic political world. Policies that have never been needed more so than now. Mr Deputy Speaker, my constituency is full of outstanding, brave and inspirational women, from doctors and nurses in our NHS to volunteers in our food banks, from teachers across our schools, in our shops and in so many other positions, both volunteers and paid. Women who contribute so much to our communities, often on low pay and in insecure work. So on International Women's Day, I say thank you to them. And Mr Deputy Speaker, I also commit to all those women in my constituency and beyond to continue to hold this government to account on all issues, but none more so than on those issues that so often disproportionately impact upon women and girls. Thank you.
Jane Hunt.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. May I first of all congratulate the Right Honourable Member for Basingstoke on securing her debate today. She is a leader amongst women, in my opinion, and I would like to thank her personally for all her help and support she's given me since I was elected in 2019. Thank you very much. If I could also mention the speech of the member for Birmingham Yardley, extremely moving speech that was made. A very long list of women who have been murdered over the last year, and extremely moving. May I add a name as well from my Loughborough constituency, not murdered, but has life-changing injuries at the age of 19 that will never mean that she can live a normal life again. Her name is Angel Lynn, and you will have seen her, perhaps the CCTV video of her being picked up by her boyfriend and physically carried into the back of a van where she was kidnapped and, I'll use the words of the court, fell out of the van at high speed on the A6 in Loughborough.
To remind the lady, this case is sub judice at the moment. It's not. Well, that's the advice I've just been given by the clerk. So please be very careful.
7 years.
The Attorney General has referred it for too lenient a sentence.
My apologies, Mr Deputy Speaker. Since it was first observed in 1911, International Women's Day has been a driving force for change. It is a day to not only empower women and celebrate their achievements, but also to raise awareness of equality issues and the very real injustices women are still facing today. This year is no exception, with the theme of Break the Bias, encouraging us all to call out gender bias, discrimination and stereotyping in order to ensure greater female participation and progression in our communities, our workplaces and our schools, colleges and universities. As an MP, I'm incredibly fortunate in an incredibly fortunate position to be able to use my own experiences as a woman in the workplace and as a mother, as well as the experiences of the thousands of women in my constituency, to help influence the change needed. Sadly, however, I am in a very small minority of women who have had this opportunity, being the 499th female of only 559 to have ever been sworn into the House of Commons. This is, of course, fewer than the number of MPs elected at any one election. Thankfully, we are already seeing the number of female MPs increase, with 220 women elected at the last election, the highest ever number. That said, this means that only 34% of MPs are women, despite the 2011 census finding that 51% of the population are women. There is clearly a lot more work still to do to ensure women are properly represented. Yes, of course.
Forgiving me, does she agree that we all, men included, have a part to play in getting women elected to positions like MP? It was former councillor Gordon Clark that encouraged me to stand for election, and I'll be forever grateful he did. Men can use their platform and voices to further equality in these spaces too.
I absolutely agree with the honourable member. Yes, indeed. Certainly Councillor Richard Shepherd of Charnwood Borough Council certainly encouraged me to come forward and stand as a candidate for the Conservative Party. So, yes, I absolutely agree. If we want to increase the number of women in public life generally, we must ensure we are leading from the front. I know that this is of particular importance to the government, the opposition and to the House, and I welcome that over the last decade a real focus has been placed on removing the barriers faced by women wanting to become MPs and enter government, most recently with the introduction of the Ministerial and Other Maternity Allowances Act 2021, which will ensure that women are not forced to choose between becoming mothers and progressing in their careers. The importance of having more women in Parliament cannot be overstated. Not only do women have a unique perspective of society and the workplace, they have also been responsible for and instrumental in some incredibly important pieces of legislation, such as banning female genital mutilation, criminalising domestic violence, and ensuring women can build up pension entitlement in their own right. They also help to inspire the next generation of female politicians and women in public life. Indeed, I was inspired to get into politics after hearing that our first female Prime Minister had taken office, causing me to investigate what that means for our country and understanding that politics is a profession for women. I was 13 at the time. As well as in Parliament, it is crucial that we have female representation in all walks of life, in particular the workplace and the boardroom. I am delighted that progress has been made in this area, with the UK having the highest Women in Work Index score in the G7 and being second in international rankings for female board representation. However, there are still more barriers to remove if we are to create an environment where women can really progress, such as bias around pay and promotion, unacceptable workplace cultures, and the ability to balance work and caring responsibilities, which all too often fall disproportionately on women. I know that the government is committed to tackling these issues, and I am fully supportive of the action we are already taking. 4. It is vitally important that we support women in the workplace, women like the impressive managers and leaders I met last year at Tarmac in my constituency, who were incredibly skilled experts and leading the way in their respective fields. Whether it is nurturing, shaping business, or developing projects and goals, women have a great contribution to make, and I would urge that we all work together to ensure that women have the opportunity to put their stamp on local communities, businesses, and the future of this country. Thank you.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This week I attended a meeting with the brave Ukrainian women politicians with the British Interparliamentary Union to discuss the humanitarian impact war has on women and girls. And news last night that the war criminal Putin now bombs maternity hospitals fills us all with disgust and is clearly a war crime. And just yesterday I chaired an event with 6 brave Afghan women to discuss the regressive impact the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan has had on those women and girls' rights. One told me, before the Taliban took over, I was someone. The day after the Taliban took over, I was no one. And it was clear from the meeting that any engagement with the Taliban must be done on the basis of strict conditionality in support of women and girls' rights in public services, employment and civil society. Now, I wish to take this opportunity to express my solidarity with these and other women across the world living in war zones or under repressive regimes. But today I want to talk about access to reproductive health care, which has been critical in the improvement of women's rights globally. The development of the contraceptive pill in the middle of the 20th century is considered one of the most crucial developments in the women's rights movement. Reproductive rights are fundamental to the physical, psychological and social well-being of women. And as the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Sexual and Reproductive Health, we know that there are still too many obstacles facing women in accessing this vital health care. One woman recently said, "I find it very difficult to find a clinic that's accessible and has appointments out of office hours." And figures from University College London, published last year, show that the proportion of unplanned pregnancies in the UK has almost doubled during the pandemic. There is still much work to do to ensure that women and girls have full control over their reproductive health. And in 2020, the APPG published the findings of our inquiry into access to contraception. We found that women are finding it increasingly difficult to access contraception that suits them, a situation made much worse by the pandemic. And even in today's Guardian, there is an article by Nell Frizzell entitled "A 10-Week Wait for a Coil. British Women are Facing a Quiet Crisis in Contraceptive Care." I'm very happy to give way.
Lady for giving way. And I'd just like to put on record that one of the difficulties as to why women find it increasingly difficult to access contraception easily is because we have a number of commissioning funding streams within the NHS, which is actually leading to under-commissioning of this vital resource. And in a time when perhaps 1 in 3 pregnancies are unplanned, and that is leading to higher abortions, which are themselves a less safe method of dealing with reproductive health than contraception. Would she join with me in encouraging the government to look properly at how contraception is commissioned?
Absolutely, and I pay tribute to my honourable friend for all the work she's done, and I know when she was a health minister she took a particular interest in this area, so absolutely. And that comes on to my next point, that despite the very best efforts of practitioners, COVID-19 exacerbating existing problems, including the long-standing funding cuts and the fragmentation in commissioning structures, which the Honourable Lady just referred to, and that saw a further restriction in access. The public health grant has faced serious cuts over the past decade. Evidence presented to our inquiry suggested that sexual and reproductive health budgets were cut by 81.2 million, that's 12%, between 2015 and 17-18. And during the same period, it is estimated that contraceptive budgets were cut by 25.9 million, that's 13%. And in Hull, in my own constituency, spending on contraception has fallen by 38% since 2013-14, and almost half of councils have reduced the number of sites delivering contraceptive services in at least 1 year since 2015. Now, our inquiry heard that the long-acting reversible contraceptive, or LARC fittings, have been most severely impacted. 11% of councils have reduced the number of contracts with GPs to fit LARCs in 2018-19, and GPs are not being adequately funded to provide LARC, which disincentivises provision. And this disparity between regions is also stark. In my own city, GPs prescribing LARC is only at 2.5 women per 100,000. In other parts of the country, it's at 51.5 per 100,000. Now, access has particularly hit marginalised groups, with services reporting a drop in the number of young, Black, Asian and minority ethnic people requesting the service. And as we continue to emerge from the pandemic, we have a unique opportunity to reshape contraceptive services according to the needs of women. For example, offering contraception as part of maternity services. Integrating care around the needs of individuals would mean that women are able to have all their reproductive health needs met at a single point of care. Now, I hope these points and the recommendations from our report are reflected in the government's upcoming sexual and reproductive health strategy. I just want to finish by talking about telemedicine for early medical abortion. I am absolutely furious by the government's decision that it would end telemedicine for early medical abortions after the 30th of August this year, ignoring the clinical advice and the evidence, if I could just finish this point, ignoring the clinical evidence and advice of many Royal Colleges and clinicians. And I am sorry to say that the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Health, who was in her place earlier on, has left, because I wanted her to particularly hear my comments on this. I'm very happy to give way.
I agree entirely with the Right Honourable Lady, and I think that she will welcome with me that Wales is continuing with this arrangement, which is being drawn to an end in September, I understand, in England. But it also leads, therefore, to questions in Wales as to why that is being permitted. And I think there really is serious questions for us here on this day, particularly, that this is being brought to an end at the end of COVID here by this government.
I absolutely agree with what the Right Honourable Lady has said. I just want to be clear, so we're all aware in the Chamber, that telemedicine for early medical abortion services has enabled thousands of women to access care at home via both pills being posted to them following a telephone consultation with a qualified nurse or midwife. And the evidence from the medical community is absolutely crystal clear. A study of more than 50,000 abortions before and after the changes in England and Wales, published by the British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynaecology in February 21, concluded that telemedicine abortion provision is effective, safe, acceptable and improves access to care. Evidence also shows that telemedicine means that women are able to access an abortion much earlier in their pregnancy, with 40% of abortions provided at less than 6 weeks. As well as the consensus in the medical community, women support the continuation of telemedicine for abortion services too, including the very influential Mumsnet. An independent poll of more than 1,100 women across the UK, commissioned by the Faculty of Sexual and Reproductive Health, shows that a clear majority want telemedicine for early medical abortion to remain. And as the Right Honourable Lady has already said, the Welsh Government has announced it will be making the pathway permanently available in Wales. I therefore struggle to see how the decision to end this service in August is in line with the government's commitment to put women at the centre of their own health care as set out in the Vision for Women's Health Strategy. It is simply based on the Health Minister's own prejudice. It is deeply disappointing and flies in the face of all the other measures that are being taken within the NHS around virtual appointments and to use digital technology. I, alongside many parliamentarians, I'm very happy to give way.
Thank you, Honourable Lady, for her comments on this. I think she's making a really powerful point. Does she feel, as I do, that this is sending a message that the government doesn't trust women to make their own decisions about their own reproductive health?
Chair of the Women and Equalities Committee, Select Committee, puts that very well. I think that's exactly the message that's being sent out. I notice that time is going by, so I will conclude. I, alongside many parliamentary colleagues across the House and in the other place, medical bodies and women's groups such as the BMA, the Royal College of General Practitioners and Women's Aid, are calling on the government now to explain exactly how they will review this decision, as they have promised to do. Where access to reproductive health care is limited, there is a ripple effect on the health and social well-being of women and girls. We must continue to stand up for the rights of women, to have full control over our own health and our own bodies. And we still, apparently, have some way to go to do that.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I want to thank my right honourable friend, the member for Basingstoke, for securing this debate today, which is always a moving and inspiring and really wide-ranging one. We've quite rightly reflected on the horror that Putin's war in Ukraine is inflicting on women there, which was demonstrated, I think, in last night's barbaric bombing of a maternity hospital. The Honourable Lady for Yardley, her haunting speech reminds us every year of the many women who are not with us to celebrate International Women's Day today. And among them this year, my constituent, Claire Abel-White, whose murder has shocked the rural community of Colston Bassett in Rushcliffe. The case is ongoing and an arrest has just been made, so I won't be discussing it any further today, but just I did want to put on record my thoughts and my prayers are with her friends and family, especially with her small children. My honourable friend for East Surrey also brought up the achievements of women in STEM, and I'm going to be asking her to feature in my campaign for British Science Week next week, where we are profiling some of the brilliant women who have STEM careers, and I hope to encourage more women and girls into those. And today I want to celebrate the achievements of an incredible group of women, female entrepreneurs, whose energy, dynamism, creativity and sheer bloody hard work create new jobs and grow our economy. Now, the UK set a new record last year. 140,000 women started their own businesses. So in total, 20% of new firms are now led by women. But, and there is a but, it's estimated that only 1% of venture capital goes to female entrepreneurs. Now, I want to call out two brilliant women in Rushcliffe, Sarah King and Claire Dunn of We Are Radical, who have decided that this has gone on for far too long. And they're time to do something about it. And as the Honourable Member for Motherwell proved in her speech, if you want something done, get a woman to do it. So they have started their Over Being Underfunded campaign to increase access to investment for female entrepreneurs. I went to see them last week. They've got an office just down the road from mine. Now, the Honourable Member for Romsey said she loved a rebel. They have a brilliant piece of artwork on their wall. It's called Rebels Get Results. It's a fabulous print. I'm looking at purchasing a copy for the Chief Whip. I'm sure he will be equally delighted by it. Their campaign has three main asks. It's extending the current timeframe to secure investment, which is offered to entrepreneurs via the government's Seed Enterprise and Investment Scheme. They want to extend that period of time from 2 years to 3. This would reflect, on average, the greater amount of time that women spend on caring responsibilities, twice as much as men during the pandemic, which obviously gives them less time to spend on their businesses, so sometimes they take longer to scale. That women are also less likely to have access to investor networks than men, so it takes longer for them to build those relationships. They're also asking to introduce gender, race and ethnicity reporting on the SAYS scheme, both in terms of the entrepreneurs it works with, but also the investors. And finally, they want to see more support, mentoring and awareness campaigns targeted at early-stage women entrepreneurs, because they know women are less likely to know about schemes like SAYS and more likely to be open and really up for mentoring and other types of support like that. Now, they hope that ministers in BEIS and the Treasury will engage with them, and also that the BEIS enterprise strategy, which is being published later this year, will reflect their asks. They are doing so much to address the problem, building their own network of investors called Halo, breaking down myths and perceived bias in the investor community. Now, the government's commissioned the Alison Rose Review back in 2019, and that identified a £250 billion boost to the UK economy through breaking down barriers to female entrepreneurs. But I don't think we're going to get very far if 99% of venture capital is currently passing female-led firms by. So I think this is something that we really have to turn our attention to now as a government. I welcome the huge amount of work the government has done to get women into senior positions in business. I am delighted that we are now second in the world for female representation on boards, which has increased by 50% in the last 6 years, as it should do. And we now, I think, need to focus our attention on doing more to empower our female entrepreneurs. If we're going to take advantage of the record number of female-led businesses founded last year, this has to be a priority for us. So I want to say a happy International Women's Day to Sarah and Claire and all the brilliant women that they work with. I'm looking forward to working with them and seeing the jobs and the innovation that their businesses are going to bring to the UK. And I do hope that ministers will agree to meet with us so they can learn more about the experience of the female entrepreneurs in the We Are Radical network, and that those experiences are better reflected in the government's approach to supporting female entrepreneurs.
Abina Apong-Azare.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Rosscliffe. I'd also like to thank the Honourable Member for Basingstoke for securing this debate. International Women's Day is an opportunity to celebrate the achievements of women, to reflect on the progress we have made in fighting gender equality, and to campaign for the change we still need to see in society. I'll come to each of these shortly, but I want to begin my speech by focusing on the international part of International Women's Day. In particular, I want to focus on the women around the world whose lives are being torn apart by conflict and violence. The women in Ukraine who face unimaginable hardship as they watch their hometowns being attacked, as they make the heart-wrenching decision whether to leave their family in the country behind in search of safety, and that they are forced to defend their country against Russian aggression. And the women in Afghanistan who face years of progress in educating girls being rolled back overnight, who face a crisis of hunger and economic collapse, and who remain separated from their families as they too try to reach safety. We know that war has a devastating impact on the lives of women. It increases instances of gender-based violence and appalling use of sexual violence. It disrupts essential services such as health and education, which so many women and girls rely on, and it leads to displacement of millions of people. So I hope today the government can commit to specific and practical support to women in Ukraine and Afghanistan. For example, we know that there are often shortages of sanitary and period products as conflicts unfold. Can the Minister ensure that this forms part of the UK's aid to Ukraine? And in relation to Afghanistan, there is still a need for the government to do more to help the women left behind, for example, by supporting the efforts to restart girls' education in the country. I also urge the government to do more to support women in Afghanistan who want to rejoin their families in this country, including many of my constituents. I will now turn to some issues closer to home. First, I want to raise again the proposal for Valerie's Law, which will introduce mandatory cultural competency training for the police and other agencies dealing with black victims of domestic violence. According to the domestic violence charity Sister Space, 86% of women of African or Caribbean heritage in the UK have either been a victim of domestic abuse or know a family member who has been assaulted. Yet despite the alarming number, the police still often ignore these nuances that complicate black survivors' experience with trying to get support. For example, some black women are told by police that they can't see any bruises, even to dismiss dangerous and life-threatening situations. Bruises are not always visible on black women's skin, as it is on women of lighter complexion. The UK's largest single provider of domestic abuse services, Refuge, recently published data showing that black women were 14% less likely to be referred by police to use their services than white survivors. Valerie's Law is named after Valerie Ford, who, along with her baby daughter, were murdered by Valerie's ex-partner in 2014, despite reporting threats which were overlooked by the police. I'm working with Sister Space to help campaign for this important change, and I'm looking forward to an upcoming petitions debate on this issue. Second, I'm proud to chair the Labour Women's Network, which supports women standing for election and advocates for greater representation within our party and beyond. Over the last year, we've been leading a campaign to keep the good stuff, which recognises that some of the innovations during the pandemic have been beneficial to women in balancing their work and family lives. I firmly believe that employers, political parties and indeed the government must look closely at how flexible working and other pandemic-related measures can continue in the years to come. Another part of LWN's work is training women to stand for public office, for example, through the Jo Cox Women in Leadership Scheme. Sadly, we now have to dedicate half of our programmes to resilience and self-care, given the levels of online abuse of women standing for office can expect to face. And we know that women from Black, Asian and ethnic minority backgrounds and members of our LGBT+ community and disabled people experience more online abuse than other people. We must see more action from both the government and the social media platforms on this issue. We will be watching closely to ensure that the online safety bill lives up to the promises on this issue. I would like to end my speech on a positive note. by recognising some of the inspirational women whose work and activism in my constituency too often goes unnoticed. Women such as Charlotte Blades and Gwen Fayemi, who helped to run Bexley Food Bank. Jatinder Rai, who is the CEO of Bexley Voluntary Service Council. Ruth Russell, Volunteer Chair of Greenwich and Bexley Hospice. Sarah Batten, Co-Director of the Erith Exchange. And Kavita Trevena, who runs Support Network and Community in Investment Organisation for women suffering from postnatal depression. I'd also like to thank the female councillors in my constituency for all their hard work, and would like to send my best wishes to the excellent female local candidates down in the local elections in May. Finally, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the brilliant women in my office without whom I could not do my job. Abby, Yinka, Grace and Alice. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Jackie Doyle-Price.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It is a great pleasure to join in this debate, and like other members, my thoughts this afternoon are with the women of Ukraine, and I'd particularly like to thank my right honourable friend, the member for Romsey, for her speech earlier, which frankly had me filling up, if truth be known, so I'm glad I had some time to deal with my emotions now. But it's a reminder as well that war situations where women are leaving and seeing their sons, their husbands, their fathers being involved in fighting, that 30 years ago last week the independent state of Bosnia was found, which of course had been itself subject to significant wars. And I'm reminded of my regular visits to Srebrenica and to the memorial at Potokari, which is lovingly maintained by bereaved women who lost their sons, fathers, brothers, uncles. And we all know the story of what happened to the genocides in Bosnia. And for many of those women, they actually haven't got a body, they haven't even got a body part, but they are dealing with their grief by maintaining the memorials to other victims as well as their own. And I think at this time, we will remember, there will inevitably be bereaved women who have left their husbands and sons behind and don't know what their ultimate fate's going to be. And for me as a Member of Parliament in this first world fantastic country of Great Britain, I just feel hopelessly inadequate watching these events unfold. And we must do everything we can to support all those victims, and particularly to give safe haven to those refugees who are fleeing. But moving on, I'd just like to reflect on some of the other contributions made today, particularly the contribution made by the Right Honourable Lady, the Member for Kingston upon Hull. And I would just say to the government, what the Right Honourable Lady is showing is that actually we're making lots of noise about women's health, and we're breaking lots of taboos in this space. But fundamentally, the biggest source of our oppression is our biology, and it is our reproductive biology, and the ability for women to control their fertility and to manage their reproductive rights in a safe way does depend on adequate contraception services, and does also depend on a safe abortion law. And I will repeat what I've said many times in this place. The abortion law is more than 50 years old. It was written before we had medical abortion, and abortion was a surgical procedure and much more dangerous to boot for that reason. And if we are really going to look at women's reproductive rights from the perspective of safety, may I helpfully suggest that perhaps we need a review which doesn't rely on individual members of Parliament tackling this as a matter of conscience. This is about how we deliver a safe environment for women to be able to manage their reproductive rights and their fertility. So I could just leave that with the government there, because until we actually properly bring that law up to date into the 21st century, any semblance of a positive women's health strategy is frankly for the birds. And I just leave that as a challenge. I'd also really like to congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for Harwich and North Essex, for bravely stepping into the debate about sex and gender and the conflict of rights which exists by conflating sex and gender together, a conflict of rights which has not been adequately tackled by either of the front benchers in this place, and frankly that's a disgrace. That's not fair to transgender people or to women. And I think it's high time that we did. And I'm glad he did it. And the fact that he's a man to do it on International Women's Day, well, that's not a matter of criticism. That is a matter for celebration. And I'm also very pleased to see my honourable friend, the member for the Advisors here, and my honourable friend, the member for Boston and Skegness, because the last 2 occasions I attended this debate, there were no men. So that is actually a way forward, because actually we do need men to value and celebrate women too. It shouldn't just be a women-only party. But turning out as... Yes, indeed.
Father of the House is also present.
My apologies. How could I forget the member for Worthing West?
I had planned to listen rather than speak, but can I say 2 things to her and through her? The first is, can the front bench, in winding up this debate, say what harm was done and what benefits there were with the early, easy, safe contraception by telephone? I think there's a responsibility on government to actually give that in the open. We can then challenge it if necessary or agree with it if they agree that it was safe, it was easy, it was convenient, it had benefits. Secondly, on the issue of sex and gender, can I agree with her that people need to speak much more openly, and that those who go calling people like Professor Kathleen Stock a dangerous extremist for her book Material Girls clearly haven't read it, because she, Jo Phoenix and others have written very plainly and sympathetically about trans people, but also determinedly that sex matters and women should be safe and feel protected.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for those comments. And the fact remains that actually women are entitled to same-sex spaces for their own sake, and it shouldn't just be about risk assessment and danger. You know, we should be able to make choices about when we want to enter spaces without men being present, and that should be as important as any potential risk that any man might pose. Turning now to the substance of my comments this afternoon, though, I really want to focus on the criminal justice system if we're talking about breaking the bias. And I do so in my capacity as chairman of the All-Party Group on Women in the Penal System. And it comes back to the point, we're reiterating the points made by my honourable friends, that men and women are different. And our laws need to reflect that, and our criminal justice system in particular needs to reflect that. And we've had a real move towards gender neutrality in how we approach public service delivery and how we approach law. But standing here on a debate to commemorate International Women's Day, I tend to view gender neutrality as just another way of centering men, because it's making us all the same. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the criminal justice system. We have a penal system built on prisons, based on the principle that you incarcerate violent and dangerous men, and that has been approached to women. And you know, we've seen study after study that has shown that prison is not the best place for women offenders, because more often than not, women offenders are more vulnerable than their male counterparts. Call me a pink-hearted liberal, but I tend to view our prison population as full of people who have been failed by the state, and that's a matter of shame for me. And that's particularly the case when it comes to women. We know that there's high rates of illiteracy and innumeracy by our prisoners, so you know, how else are they going to get on in life? We know that there's a huge number of people who've been through the care system, where they've been through care and then been left on the scrap heap. And in the case of women, we know many of them are victims of sexual abuse. And in that context, prison is not the best place for them. And we've seen study after study which has shown this. And every time we make progress in this area, and we actually start to say, well, actually, this is an opportunity for that first intervention, support women and address that vulnerability, we seem then to go backwards. And I'd really just like to highlight the fact that, you know, this government has a female offenders strategy, but is equally investing in 500 more prison places for women. And I really do think we need to properly join the dots on this and use the opportunities to make interventions to support women and break that cycle of offending, because we all know that once someone has been incarcerated, the chances that they then embark on a lifetime of reoffending and re-entering prison is very high, and that's not good for them, but it's not good for society either. and neither is it good for the taxpayer. So we just do need to get this right. We know also that many of the women don't actually belong there in the first place. And one of the issues I've been taking up with the Ministry of Justice is the extent to which women are remanded in prison for their own protection, which at a time when we have a mental health policy which has been removing police cells and prisons from as places of safety, recognising these are not good environments where people are mentally unwell, we are still remanding women in prison for their own safety. Now, I thought this was only going to be a small number of women. I thought probably no more than a dozen a year, because having raised this with the government, I couldn't get any data on it. However, Her Majesty's Prisons Inspector visited 3 prisons last year and in total found 68 women who'd been remanded in prison for their own protection. These were not people who committed an offence. This was not a punishment. Totally inappropriate for a country like this to be remanding women in prison for that purpose. And that's just in 3 prisons in total. So across the whole system, we know that women being remanded for their own protection are a significant proportion of the prison establishment. And frankly, that's not good enough. I'm ashamed of it, and I really do call on the government to do better on it. And my criticism actually isn't with the Ministry of Justice. One of the issues is that the Ministry of Justice is sweeping up the failings of other organisations within the public sector. They're sweeping up the ability of local authorities to offer safe spaces for women to be sent to when they're at risk. Mental health services are sweeping up that failure by the Department of Health. And I would encourage the Ministry of Justice to actually be rather more robust in its dealings with other departments and say, actually, do you know what? These aren't our problems, they're yours. And we should not be dealing with vulnerable people within our estate. The other side, of course, of the criminal justice system, where women are particularly negatively impacted, is as victims. And we've had a number of debates in recent weeks about the poor prosecution rate for sexual violence crimes and rape in particular. And having spoken to victims, I mean, one of the reasons for this is that they are treated as a piece of evidence in terms of that prosecution. So it's not something, having gone through trauma, to have to constantly relive it in a dehumanising way isn't going to be the best way of making sure that we bring people to punishment. So we've really got to look at that. I know there's been a lot of investment in services here, but we've still not got it right. But my biggest challenge on that is actually who the victim is who is more likely to get justice, because we've seen over and over again, we've had reference earlier in this debate to victim blaming, but and this is at the heart of it. We see over and over again that assumptions are made about victims that really impede their ability to get justice. White working class girls in northern towns and cities were victims of abuse for many years before public authorities would properly turn attention to it, because they weren't prepared to give that challenge. I'd also highlight, what we loosely describe as honour killings. Honour killings. What kind of a phrase is that for people who are murdered? Murdered by their families, who should be loving them and keeping them safe. And we call them honour killings. Honour, a positive word. Killing for a murder. I mean, that very phrase is an absolute illustration of discrimination against those victims. I'm actually getting very emotional just thinking about it. But again, in the context of the list that the Honourable Member for Birmingham Yardley read out, I know we don't have to make much of a study to realise what the social economic background of most of those victims is, because the only ones we ever read about in the papers are nice, white, middle-class people with professional backgrounds. They're the ones that the media get excited about. People who engaged in prostitution disappear every week. Not a column inch. Not a column inch. But these are victims. These are people who are victims. These are women who are victims of male violence against women and girls, by the way. Let's not pussyfoot around this. This is a gendered crime. And my humble friends who are here, I know, won't take offence when I point out that these are crimes committed by men. And this is exactly what we need to face up to, because we are not going to tackle this issue unless we tackle it as a society. And that means men stepping up too. Yes, I will.
The Honourable Lady is making an extraordinarily passionate speech, and she's absolutely right to make that point. Men are 99% of the problem, but we can be 50% of the solution.
Well, I welcome that comment from my own friend, and I'm not surprised to hear it from him. But I would actually go further than that. We'll not fix this problem until men become part of the solution. And I'm afraid the government needs to stop pussyfooting around talking about violence against women and girls. And let's say it for what it is. It's male violence against women and girls.
Karen Smith.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And it is a genuine pleasure to follow on from my friend on the Select Committee in that speech, and particularly as a former health minister. I think her comments about the importance of health ministers in particular, with taking heed to experts and patient safety, are incredibly well made, and what we're seeing now is an absolute disgrace, and I know that we will get that overturned, Mr Deputy Speaker, because as I look around this chamber, I'm so honoured to be surrounded by so many brilliant and inspirational women, and we often focus, and as we have done in this debate today, and it is important, on the way that which women's lives could be improved. I really today want to give a very clear message to women, and particularly to young women, about how great it is to be a woman. I love being a woman, and I love being a woman MP, number 430, because I do worry that we are sending some bad messages to young women in particular, because once they've navigated adolescence, which is so hard for everyone, we talk about pay gaps, glass ceilings, judgment as whether you're going to have a child or not have a child, worry whether you can have a child or can't have a child, constantly having to refight the battle that it is my body and I will control it, the violence, and then there's the menopause, and then there's osteoporosis, and then there's a pensions gap, and then you might find yourself in an inadequate care system, employing low-paid women, supporting older women, facing social isolation. It's not a happy picture, is it? There are so many issues that, of course, do blight women's lives in my constituency and beyond, but today I want to challenge that narrative, and I want to celebrate how great it is to be a woman. Young women going into the new workforce in the future have so much to look forward to. There are huge opportunities in the workforce of the future. Improved research on women's health issues, longer healthy life expectancy, and a culture which is changing how we think about family roles and recognising the key caregiving role that men are starting to play. Now, I learnt my politics as a young woman from watching and learning in the 1970s and 80s those women who were around me. My mother, my aunties, my grandmother, they have formed me. I learnt what went on in the home, though. The discussions that women had around the table wasn't actually the same that was often talked about in public. That's particularly true of those of us from a working class Irish population, I think, in this country. I learnt that women as individuals have power. We can influence things, we can do remarkable things. But I also learnt as I grew up that unless we have economic and political power to change the structures in which we live, we can never be equal in that society. And I have seen that change, and I have been part of that remarkable change. Thanks to the women in the Labour Party that I joined in the 1980s, we changed structures and forced all women shortlists. We changed the face of Parliament in 1997. And in Bristol, I am very proud to have worked for women MPs at that time, and we had women MPs leading that charge, and I'm really proud to work with my honourable friends, the member for Bristol West and Bristol East in Bristol at the moment. And I would also commend in our positive celebration that Bristol Live, 137 women across Bristol that we celebrated this week. If we just look at the vaccination effort, I'd just like to highlight my friend for a long time and colleague, Bristol's Director of Public Health, Christina Gray. The vaccination effort was led by head nurse Anne Morris, and the CCG was led by Julia Ross as the Chief Executive. And I'd also like to welcome Sarah Crew as our new Police Chief Constable. There are more amazing women involved in community action than I can mention today, but I really want to pay tribute to those women in my constituency who are leading and inspiring in fields as diverse as tackling food poverty, the charitable sector, music and the arts. In my lifetime, the opportunities for women have expanded exponentially, and I'm so proud of all of them and to be part of them here and across the country. Continuing to push boundaries so that everywhere we can lead our lives to the full. Because it's really fun being a woman. I love how we form friendships, share experiences, how we swap tips for getting through life, how we trade secrets, how we organise, how we challenge, how we do politics, how we make change. I love our creativity and our variety. And I love how we always remember that what we can achieve, what if we put our minds to it. And I want to celebrate that joy. We can achieve so much individually, but we do need structures to support women's efforts. And the Labour Party has consistently taken the action to ensure that we get the structural change that women need. It is Labour governments that have shown what's been achieved. It is Labour governments that has actually introduced legislation on equal pay, sex discrimination, the Equalities Act, minimum wage, maternity rights. And it is the next Labour government that will do the same. And I hope that's with my honourable friend, the member from Oxford East. There is no levelling up anywhere unless women's work inside and outside of employment is at the heart of all plans, and currently it is not. Not just pay, but good terms and conditions. There is so much we can learn in the pandemic that has been led by women about the future. Companies with women at the top perform better. Women-led businesses contribute billions to the economy, and we will be at the heart of the next government and the next rise in the economy. Now, I am a mother of 3 boys growing into fantastic young men. I'm so proud of them, and I'm so conscious of how important women's role as role models are for everyone, not just other women. We need to ensure that conversations and education focus not only on what women can achieve, but how important our male allies are, and that tackling many of the challenges that have been mentioned here today requires a change in the dominant culture surrounding male behaviour. And one of the, at the very sad loss of our recent colleague Jack Dromey, I thought when my friend, the Honourable Member for Campbell and Peckham spoke about Jack, that he thought his role in life was to lift her up. And I am so honoured to have my husband, Rob, to do the same for me. I wouldn't be here without him. It's a century since the first women Labour MPs were elected. I'm privileged not only to be an MP for the great constituency of Bristol South, but been surrounded by so many others. I pay tribute to them all. In my time here, we've had Brexit, we've had COVID, and now we've got war. My friend, the Honourable Member for Wirral South, highlighted us the other day that over 90% of the Brexit debates were dominated by men. We will not let that happen when we talk about the war and the future and the horrific things that are happening to women right now in Ukraine. Men do often dominate the public face of those debates, but we will not let them. Our message to women is we are here, we are staying, we are growing, and we're pulling you up with us.
Yeah. Excellent.
Matt Warman.
Deputy Speaker, it's a privilege to speak again in the International Women's Day debate. It has become something of a cliche for men speaking in that debate to talk about themselves as suddenly awakened to feminism when they become fathers of daughters. To me, it's always rather begged the question of what sort of a world those fathers thought the mothers of their daughters lived in. But nonetheless, it's not a wholly useless lens to look at perhaps some of this debate through. And I sent my daughter, Eleanor, to school on World Book Day dressed as Rosie Revere, Engineer, a character from a book by an American author called Andrea Beatty in a series called The Questioneers that even includes a character called Sophia Valdez, Future Prez. So for 5-year-old Eleanor, the idea of a female Prime Minister is very much already on the table. And that's an idea I think we can all get behind, be we fans of Margaret Thatcher, Theresa May, or indeed the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party. So perhaps, maybe, the fact that I made Eleanor's dress for World Book Day myself is a glass ceiling smashed as well. Although it did remind me that there is no word for seamstress that doesn't imply only women can sew. So we still swim in a soup of linguistic everyday sexism. And the fact remains that engineers or other male-dominated professions have a long, long way to go. When I was a minister at DCMS, the fact that I was able to foster massive growth in the diversity of people working in AI and cyber was really only because we started from such incredibly low numbers. Strategies are in place, they do start at school, and we can't go fast enough. But there is something where I would like to go slower, and that is time. The vast majority of young women and girls report they've been harassed or groped at some point. YouGov reports that more than 2/3 of women have felt unsafe walking at night. Only slightly fewer report feeling unsafe in taxis or with a tradesperson in their home, or even walking alone in the daytime. These are experiences that are wholly alien to the vast majority of men, and that total disconnect is a huge part of the problem. To put that another way, Mr. Deputy Speaker, Eleanor is 5 today. How long have I got before she comes home to tell me she was harassed or worse on the school bus? How long has she got until I worry when she has to call a plumber to a student house? How long has she got before she fears the route she takes walking home? And what can we from this privileged platform in Parliament do in the meantime to try and address some of these fairly sickening thoughts? The answer, of course, will never be enough. I commend the government's approach to putting more resources into the police and crucially into prosecution to tackle the worst of violence against women and girls, and into education and beyond to tackle the culture that will in due course see more women doing supposedly male jobs and more men doing traditionally female jobs. We must all show rather than simply say that it can be done, although I'm sure that my own dressmaking skills will be left to myself. But this is society's problem. It is not solely Parliament's. But second, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this debate must be about equity as much as it is about equality. Providing everyone with the same opportunities to live, work and play safely means providing different people with the different tools they need to get over the same obstacles. And I would, to take one example, wholly endorse the approach of the Welsh Government when it comes to the telemedicine that has been referred to earlier in this debate, and I hope that this government will come to the same conclusion when it reviews it. But if I could pick just one area to conclude, Mr. Deputy Speaker, where I urge the government to go even further than it currently is, it is in tackling the multiplicity of factors that mean childcare still falls disproportionately on women, something exacerbated hugely by COVID. In everything from the design of our towns and cities, the attitude of employers, and the average time spent commuting, we can do so much more to give men and women equal opportunities to succeed. And I think it is in tackling childcare that perhaps we can unleash the productivity of half the population even further. Thank you.
Mr. Savile Roberts.
And I think that many of us like to think that history is a series of incremental improvements, but recent events show this to be naive. And I begin, I'm afraid, with the sad observation that many of the inequalities and barriers facing women today have remained stubbornly obstinate. And we should be alert that history is not a one-way route to nirvana. The pandemic, of course, the COVID pandemic, has underscored the gendered divisions in our society, and it's proved them to be long-standing and structural. This includes poverty and job insecurity, with global management firm McKinsey noting that women's jobs were nearly twice as vulnerable as those of men during the initial months of the COVID-19 pandemic. They also found that women made up 39% of global employment, but accounted for 54% of overall job losses during this period. And one explanation for this disproportionate effect on women is that COVID-19 increased the burden of unpaid care, which women are expected to perform as part of the gender role assigned to them, assigned to us by society. And even in the chaos of war, such gender roles endure. For example, we've seen from afar, we're lucky, aren't we, that we're seeing it from afar, but how many Ukrainian women have stepped up to care for their family, their friends and their neighbours, as men are conscripted to fight against Putin's oppressive invasion. And women also, of course, make up the majority of adult refugees from Ukraine, many thousands of whom are being delayed and seeking sanctuary in the UK due to the painfully slow and limited Home Office visa system, to our shame. It is because of this expectation to be caregivers that women have a unique perspective on war. They hold families together as they are battered by events beyond their control. And I think we see this now in this war because the digital nature of the images that are transferred to us almost instantaneously. And that has brought home to us the sheer shock of the changes that can be wrought upon families, utterly by events completely beyond their control. And we see that playing out tragically. Closer to home in Wales, gender equality charity Chwarae Teg have also shown that inequality is often driven by the burden of caring responsibilities fallen disproportionately on women. They demonstrate that caring responsibilities account for 24.1% of economically inactive women in Wales, compared with 5.8% for men. That's why Plaid Cymru, in our cooperation agreement with Welsh Government, are expanding free childcare to all 2-year-olds in Wales to provide greater support for women to pursue their own careers and their life goals. Another area, and I'm very much aware that the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Basingstoke, raised this as well, where progress is slow, is in political representation. Now, 43% of Senedd members are female, a figure which is lower for Welsh MPs at 35%, and only 29% of Welsh councillors are women. Without a vibrant and diverse political culture which ensures women are represented in all positions of power and which values their contribution, how can we ever hope to end gender inequality? Plaid Cymru plans to address this glaring democratic deficit by backing Senedd reform, and this would include, and I am excited about this, I am excited about this, you can tell by how I'm talking about it, expanding the number of members in Senedd, which we desperately need to have effective government and effective scrutiny. We desperately need it. 60 members is not enough to do the roles that government need to be carried out effectively. And this will include expanding the membership, as I said, and introducing a voting system which is as proportional and as possible, and to establish gender quotas in law in Wales. I am excited about this. This in itself will help to break the bias. Turning to women's safety, of course, we've witnessed the murders of Wen Jingling in Wales, and of course Sarah Everard and Sabina Nessa, and the whole names, tragically, that were listed earlier. Hundreds of women at the hands of men in recent years. This reminds us of the shockingly high level of abuse, violence and predatory behaviour that women face in Wales and across the UK, with, for example, 71% of women saying they've experienced sexual harassment in public places. Such a situation cannot be tolerated to continue, and change is needed. Now, one positive proposal is for justice and policing system to be devolved in Wales, so that we could align the support that we have from our own Parliament more effectively. Devolving justice would enable us to tackle structural inequalities such as gender-based violence. It would allow us to integrate Welsh Government's Violence Against Women, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Violence Act with policing, courts, prisons and other services currently run from Westminster. Let us bear in mind that we still do not have a women's prison. Many of us do not want a women's prison, but we have no residential provision whatsoever in Wales at present. And I think it was last mooted 3 years ago that this would be changed, and we've yet to have that. And we should be placing education and health and housing at the heart of prevention and rehabilitation for offenders. A high proportion of women, of course, who enter prison are themselves victims of domestic abuse and sexual assault. By devolving justice, we could expand community alternatives to prison so that women in Wales are closer to their families and their children as part of their rehabilitation. We could shift the obsession with incarceration and look at supporting vulnerable women and tackling the underlying issues that lead to offending. The time to act is now. The First Minister of Wales said this week is not a matter of when, it is a matter of when and not if that justice must be devolved. If only I could express myself more effectively when I'm enthusiastic about something. I am pleased that this is now the Welsh Government's position, and I would very much like a similar position to be iterated from the opposition front benches here as well. And it is, of course, a commitment that runs alongside our cooperation agreement with Plaid Cymru. Now, there's far more that I could say on the topic of International Women's Day, but I believe the points I've outlined today represent some of the most pressing issues, and I am proud that my party, Plaid Cymru, is calling for positive change for women and girls in Wales and the wider world. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Danny Kruger.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's been humbling and very disquieting listening to the accounts of abuse and hatred and discrimination and, of course, of violence and murder that we've heard this afternoon. And I pay particular tribute to the family of Ellie Gould and their friends, the family of Poppy D.V. Waterhouse, who've been in the gallery this afternoon. Ellie was a girl in Wiltshire, a family of Wiltshire people, murdered very young, as was Poppy. And I pay tribute to their campaign for the law to change. And I look forward to the conclusion of the Wade Review, which is looking into the circumstances of those murders. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to speak briefly about, firstly, about the economy in which women find themselves, and secondly, about gender, about the politics of gender. We've heard about how behind every great woman is a great man. I'm proud to stand behind so many great women on our bench today, and opposite so many great women as well. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm the son and the grandson of full-time working women who are obviously also mothers, and very good mothers, I emphasise. And I spent 10 years. I spent 10 years working with my wife for the charity that we founded together, working in prisons, working in Holloway Prison, before it was thankfully sold off, disbanded, closed down. And I'm very glad that my children have such role models in their mother, grandmother, great-grandmother. And I echo the point made by the Honourable Member for Bristol South a moment ago about the way that opportunities have opened up for girls and young women in our time. Of course, women have all the legal rights that they need, and increasingly they have that equality is becoming a reality. But there is so much more to be done, as we've been hearing this afternoon. And perhaps just as worrying, the idea that women can have it all often just means that women must do it all, must continue to do all the work they were doing before. And this presents also very difficult choices. And not just for women. I also made the costume for my daughter's World Book Day, but I advised my honourable friend just to use cardboard boxes. That's what I did. It's so much simpler than sewing together. My daughter wanted to go as the boy in the tower, which is a lot easier a very easy costume to put together. I do recommend it. So we need a more balanced economy, is my simple policy point. We need work to be closer to home. We need men and women to be able to mix the work they do for pay in the commercial economy with work they do with children and with their elderly parents, and work in the community. This will be better for everyone, for children, for older people, for our neighbours and for ourselves. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, on to the difficult topic. I regret the suggestion that's been made on benches opposite today that International Women's Day is somehow not a moment in which it's appropriate to discuss what actually a woman is. I wish this wasn't a controversial topic, but the fact is that it is, and surely this is a time and a place in which that topic can be discussed. I noticed today that the leader of the Scottish Government has announced an official apology to the victims of the Witches Act, for the victims of the hunt against witches back in the early modern period in Scotland. I hope she would also extend some sympathy to the victims of today's witch hunts. Women, mostly women, but also men, who are vilified, cancelled, professionally destroyed, physically threatened for their beliefs. People who simply believe in the biological difference between men and women. And I pay particular tribute to the Honourable Member for Canterbury, the Honourable Member for Edinburgh South West, for their courage in this topic. And I call attention to the interim report from Dr. Hilary Cass, which is just out, which highlights the vertiginous increase in young girls, teenage girls presenting as trans. And I'm afraid I don't believe that we have suddenly discovered a whole new population of trans people who were repressed or denied before. I fear that we are, by telling people that they can change sex, we are further confusing a lot of very confused young people at the most confusing time of their life. And I'm also concerned, just as great a concern, as the biological males deciding in adulthood that they want access to women-only spaces. And I echo the points made by my honourable friends for Harwich and North Essex and Thurrock on this topic. I hope there is some value in a man saying this. I think that trans activism is a new form of misogyny. It involves the essential denial of reality. And I think we need a legal definition of what a woman is. A woman is an adult female. This is a biological and immutable reality, and it's time to recognise this in the law. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm very pleased to follow the Honourable Member for Devizes. There's many things about which we disagree, but there are some things about which we agree, and I thank him for his kind comments. Can I also congratulate the Right Honourable Member for Basingstoke in securing this debate, and congratulate the many honourable members who have made interesting and valuable contributions, particularly my honourable friend, the member for Motherwell and Wishaw, who was such a doughty campaigner for disability rights, and particularly the rights of disabled women. Madam Deputy Speaker, during this International Women's Day debate, it is the women of Ukraine who should be uppermost in our minds. This morning, I and other female MPs, a cross-party group, met with the Ukrainian ambassador's wife, and speaking with her impressed upon me the terrible burden that Ukrainian women face as they flee their country with their children, often leaving their male relatives behind and uncertain of their destination. The majority of the now millions of refugees fleeing Ukraine are women and children, and what these women need is visa-free access to the United Kingdom with their children. We must match the European Union on this, no ifs and no buts, and so let's get on with it. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, women are particularly vulnerable in war because of their sex. This is because women are particularly vulnerable to sexual violence at the hands of men. That violence is sex-based and directed at women because of our biology and the fact that we are weaker than men. Sex matters. I don't know why we call it gender-based violence, because it's not gender-based violence, it's sex-based violence. Gender is a social construct. Sex is a material reality. And I'd like to hear us talk more about sex. I'd like to hear us talk about the sex-based pay gap. I'd like to hear us talk about the fact that, as Professor Alice Sullivan has said so powerfully in The Guardian today, it is mothers and not fathers who bear the burden of parenthood. Research shows that men often get a pay premium as a result of parenthood, but women's pay goes down. And I would also like us to be able to say, as is the case in law, that lesbians like myself are same-sex attracted women, not same-gender attracted. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, what you cannot define, you cannot protect. And what you cannot name cannot be properly discussed and debated. And that's why the stealthy erasure of sex-based language from our statute book and public and private policy making should be resisted. And it's also why politicians and policymakers should be precise in their language and not conflate sex and gender. Last month, Scotland's Supreme Court reminded lawmakers that reference to the protected characteristic of sex in the Equality Act is a reference to a man or a woman, for which purpose a woman is a female of any age. And the court said, and I quote, "Provisions in favour of women based on the protected characteristic of sex, by definition, exclude those who are biologically male." That is the law. I'm quoting from the case of For Women Scotland against the Lord Advocate and the Scottish Ministers, and I'm quoting from paragraph 36 of the judgment, the highest court in Scotland. So I defy anyone to say that what I've just said is transphobic. It isn't. It is the law, and it's based on the Equality Act, which also protects trans people from discrimination by the very widely drawn protected characteristic of gender reassignment. And the Equality Act was passed by the Labour Party. All credit to them for doing that. And I know the Right Honourable Member for Camberwell and Peckham, who's not in her place, for who I have the highest regard, was very instrumental in passing that Act. And the Equality Act is an act hugely valued by my party, the Scottish National Party, so much so that when our current First Minister was drafting the Constitution for an independent Scotland in 2014, she decided to enshrine in that Constitution the protections afforded to women and the other protected characteristics in the Equality Act. It was going to be part of the fundamental law of Scotland. I think it would be good if more Scottish politicians remembered that and celebrated it. I'd like to quote Suzanne Moore in an excellent column in today's Telegraph Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not really in the habit of buying or reading the Telegraph, although a very dear friend of mine who's now dead used to say that she bought the Telegraph every day so that she would have something reliable with which to disagree. But there's a very good column in it today by Suzanne Moore, and she says in that, "Words matter because women naming ourselves and our experience matters." And I quote again Suzanne Moore, "As the American social reformer and women's rights activist Susan B. Anthony had it, no self-respecting woman should wish or work for the success of a political party that ignores her sex. And no self-respecting woman, in my view, should wish or work for the success of a political party who makes her rights as a woman or a lesbian conditional on her acceptance of gender identity politics. My rights as a woman and a lesbian are not conditional on my accepting gender identity politics. Yet, as a member of the advisory group of the organisation Sex Matters, and I make reference to my register of interests in that respect, I'm aware of many cases across the United Kingdom of women being harassed and investigated at work for expressing gender-critical views. But now, thanks to the courage and resilience of a woman called Maya Forstater and her legal team, we have an Employment Appeal Tribunal ruling that gender-critical beliefs are protected under the Equality Act. And that, Madam Deputy Speaker, was a major victory for freedom of belief and freedom of speech across these islands. Professor Joe Phoenix of the Open University and postgraduate student Raquel Rosaria Sanchez of Bristol University are just some of the brave women taking their universities to court for failure to defend them from harassment because of their gender-critical views. And across the United Kingdom, many women and indeed men are now taking their employees and membership organisations, like the Green Party of England and Wales, to court for discriminating against them on the grounds of their beliefs that sex is real and immutable. So what I say to all the gender-critical women watching this debate today is we are starting to win this debate, and people like me won't give up no matter what's thrown in our road. Maya Forstater's win is not the only significant one since last International Women's Day. I've already mentioned For Women Scots' win in Scotland's Supreme Court. Fair Play for Women had a major court victory on the meaning of sex in the census in England and Wales, although they were not so successful in Scotland. And yes, I will give way.
Well, she's making a terrific speech. But would she agree with me that actually men have got to stand up for women's rights too? And there are too many men who stand back from this debate and say, oh, well, this is a women's issue, I'm not going to get involved. And I think that's a shame, and that's why I spoke in today's debate.
I entirely agree with the Honourable Gentleman, and in fact it's even worse. There are many men, young men, involved in this debate who have embraced a new form of misogyny, and I know that to my cost, and I would hope that that will start to change. But I'm trying to be positive, and I want to list, before I sit down, just a couple of the other successes that there have been in the last year for gender-critical women such as myself. My friends at the LGB Alliance are registered as a charity now, and they held a major conference attended by many parliamentarians, and I see some of the parliamentarians who attended the conference here. Sadly, a straight married member of this House saw fit to protest outside the conference, which was organised by lesbians to discuss the rights of same-sex attracted people. Madam Deputy Speaker, I thought I'd seen the last of that sort of lesbophobia in the 90s, but it turns out that I was wrong. And I repeat that lesbian rights are not conditional on our accepting gender identity theory. Another positive development has been the Equality and Human Rights Commission entering the debate on self-identification and how to frame the quite appropriate ban on conversion therapy. And they entered it with a voice of calm common sense, reminding us that human rights are universal and that all protected characteristics under the Equality Act deserve protection. And others have mentioned the very welcome interim report of the Cass Review today, and I hope the Minister will be able to assure us that the Government will look very carefully at the interim report of the Cass Review and look into this alarming phenomenon of so many young women feeling so uncomfortable with their identity as women and going through puberty in our society that they feel that they have to change their identity to cope with those pressures. I will, yes.
Can I add 2 points to her and through her? The first is Suzanne Moore ought to have been able to write her column for The Guardian. And I hope that The Guardian tomorrow will report the speech that the Honourable Lady is making in full and explain why Suzanne Moore can't publish her own thoughts in her own newspaper as it was. Second point, on the LGB Alliance conference, which I attended, I went up to some of the people protesting outside and had asked if they'd read the book Trans, whether they'd read the book Material Girls. They said no. And then invited them to join me in asking Liam Hackett, the chief executive of the anti-bullying charity Ditch the Label, if he would withdraw his words of describing Kathleen Stock as a dangerous extremist for giving her plain views on women's rights.
Well, I agree with what he says, and I'm proud to call Professor Kathleen Stock a friend, and she's a very admirable scholar, a feminist and a lesbian who's written very carefully about these issues and the way she's been traduced by students at her university and by some, I'm sad to say, some politicians in one of my favourite cities, which is Brighton, is absolutely disgraceful. But I wanted to be positive today, and I do think, you know, that, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the tide is turning on this issue, and I think I'm living proof that cancellation doesn't always work. So just before I sit down, I've got a couple of questions for the Minister. Will she back the Equality and Human Rights Commission to produce solid guidance on definitions of the protected characteristics and single-sex services? Because a lot of the harassment that I've described stems from women setting out the case for single-sex services and then facing wrongful accusations of transphobia. Secondly, will she push for government departments to end the use of external human resources benchmarking schemes for legal compliance with the Equality Act? Because as we saw in the Akua Reindorf report at Essex University, some external benchmarks, I'm sad to say, some from Stonewall, of whom I used to be a supporter but no longer am, have been wrong in law. And finally, once the EHRC publish some decent guidance, will she review civil service HR policies to make sure they are in line with the law of the land under the Equality Act rather than in line with prejudiced lobbying groups? Thank you.
Thank you. Laura Trott.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it really is a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Edinburgh South West. And I salute her courage in talking about these issues, because they're not always easy, but they must be discussed. I congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for Basingstoke, on securing this important debate. And there have been many important topics discussed today, not least the early access to telemedicine for early-stage abortion, which I think merits much further discussion in this House. But I want to concentrate on a topic that my right honourable friend, the member for Romsey, so movingly covered beforehand, and that is the women and girls in Ukraine. Images from war are often characterised by tanks, by physical destruction and the loss of life in combat. But conflict is as much about those on the sidelines as it is about those on the front line. We know from history that in war, rape is routinely used as a weapon, a barbaric weapon. It brings incomprehensible damage to victims, it subjugates women through fear and stigma, and children born as a result of these violent acts often struggle with issues of identity. Sexual violence in conflict has rightly been recognised as a war crime by the International Criminal Court. Such violence has been a stain on our history, and I'm appalled that we are already hearing reports of history repeating itself in Ukraine. Speaking at an online event hosted by Chatham House, the Ukrainian Foreign Minister reportedly shared details about how Russian soldiers are raping Ukrainian women in the occupied territories. Julie Bindel, the investigative journalist, has reported that well-known porn sites have had new videos uploaded by Russian soldiers documenting disgustingly brutal crimes. Madam Deputy Speaker, we cannot let these atrocities go unpunished. Under the leadership of this government, and following an initiative spearheaded by the noble Lord Hague, there's been a great deal of progress to end sexual violence in conflict. The integrated review set out clearly the mission to strengthen justice for providers. The G7 communique set up plans to prevent and end sexual violence towards women and girls in conflict. And last year, the UK, alongside its allies, issued a strong statement that the use of sexual violence as a weapon in conflict is a red line akin to the use of chemical weapons. The Prime Minister has spoken strongly in this place to say that sexual violence in conflict will not be tolerated, and those who are found to have committed it will be punished. But the challenge for all of us in this place is that to achieve that, we must have survivors in Ukraine coming forward, and we must have a coordinated international approach to collect the evidence. We all know that we have challenges domestically to encourage women to come forward and to be heard. But imagine the fear of coming forward when not only have you been abused, but your country has been invaded, and invaded by Russia, which effectively decriminalised domestic violence in 2017. We must now send a clear message to the women of Ukraine that you will be supported. Our actions must be stronger than just words. We must collate the evidence. We must engage with the International Criminal Court, and we must prosecute. None of us can allow this to pass by. We all have a responsibility. And this International Women's Day, we must say that sexual violence in conflict is not inevitable, and we must never, ever allow it to be inevitable.
Yeah. Bel Rabiro Ali.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to participate in this debate and celebrate the trailblazers who have made it possible for so many women to come through these doors and sit on these benches. The women who have fought, protested, sacrificed and put their lives on the line in their efforts to secure gender equality, to grant women things like the right to go to school, to work, to vote, simple things like to open a bank account in our own name, and so many other rights that we couldn't bear to live without. But I would argue that these women would not just want us to celebrate, but also to continue to agitate, because there is still a long way to go and more to be done if we're going to get to a state where women can truly be considered equal to men. This year, as with every International Women's Day, organisations have taken to social media to share their commitment to gender equality and to breaking the bias as this year's theme. And in response, the Twitter page Gender Pay Gap Bot tweeted the pay gap of those organisations. Now, some organisations could hold their heads up high, like the Contact Company, Abbey Croft Ledger, the St John's Ambulance and a few others. But unfortunately, those organisations were in the minority. Because in 2022, we still live in a society where 83% of the UK's most popular jobs have a gender pay gap, and a recent Labour Party analysis shows that at the current rate of progression, the gender pay gap will not close until 2059. So we need urgent action to change the system of pay inequality that's not just plain wrong, but also leaves so many women vulnerable to abuse. And when it comes to representation in senior positions right across society, representation of women is still woefully low. Now, I'm proud to be part of a parliamentary Labour Party that is 51% women, and I wouldn't pretend that it's something that happened overnight, but when the time came, we didn't wait for attitudes to change, we didn't rest on platitudes, we took action to increase representation, and the result is somebody like myself who is the product of All Women Shortlist, and a parliamentary party that reflects not only society in its makeup, but in the quality of debate and policies that are put forward. So to all of those in organisations across the country who are wringing their hands and saying, oh, it's so hard, and oh, what do we do in the case of women's equality, you're just making excuses. Change doesn't come just because time goes on. It's something that you have to make happen, and because of the work of women in this House and across society, enforcing equality has never actually been easier. You see best practice, policy, legislation, all these different things at your disposal. So in 2022, the underrepresentation of women in senior roles and a gender pay gap is actually a choice. So I won't applaud all of those colourful social media bits that have gone up on different organisations and the events and the seminars that have gone by in past days for women. And I won't applaud those organisations for saying that they're trying, because actually they're just failing. The ones that continue to preside over these situations have made a choice, and their choice has been to discriminate against women every single day, and they should be thoroughly ashamed of themselves. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's right that we've discussed domestic gender inequality. It's obviously extremely important, but we must remember that we are celebrating International Women's Day, a day for all women wherever they are in the world. And our minds rightfully turn to the plight of women in Ukraine facing Putin's aggression, and those women that we all saw this morning in the maternity hospital, those left behind in the country, as so many women often are in this situation. and those who have fled and who are currently being denied asylum by countries like our own, alongside refugees from other countries, also fleeing war and persecution. Now, my honourable friend, the member for Poplar and Limehouse, was quite right when she said no one could claim to support standing up for all women if we allow a heinous piece of legislation like the Nationality and Borders Bill to go ahead, which will only worsen the situation for some of the most vulnerable women in the world. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I worry about a movement for women's equality and a feminism that doesn't represent all women, of all classes, of all nationalities and of all races. And I was sad, or I've sad to be here in the past, of black women speak of being a feminist but not being able to call themselves as such because they don't believe that movements for women's equality typically represent their experiences as a black woman. Now, when the majority of women in the world are of colour, a women's movement that doesn't recognise the impact that racism plays in a fundamental role it has on increasing inequality amongst these women, then it's not truly a movement that represents all women, and it's not worth what it says it's worth, and that's not acceptable. And the idea that we should fight for equality or make concessions when it comes to women's equality for a certain group of women first, and then later we can get to this other group of women, is actually been the bane, I think, of the women's equality movement, and that absolutely has to change. We have to demand equality for all women, and we have to do it right now. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, in my view, in this country at the moment, the equality we seek for women doesn't have to be so hard. So in 2022, if your organisation continues to preside over underrepresentation and a gender pay gap, it is simply just trash. And if you are not actively a part of the solution to end gender equality, then you are simply just another part of the problem. Thank you.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to echo the opening remarks from the Right Honourable Member for Basingstoke. She's absolutely right. Today we stand in solidarity with the women of Ukraine. Our hearts go out to their suffering, and we stand in awe to their bravery and resilience. Women, Madam Deputy Speaker, are all too often the most vulnerable, and they are the real victims of war and conflict. And the Honourable Member for Sevenoaks has just made a very passionate speech about this. Globally, an estimated 736 million women have experienced sexual violence. That is 1 in 3 of us. Over 80,000 women were murdered in 2020, most at the hands of a close relation. Violence extends to children too. 60 million girls are being sexually assaulted on their way to school every year. These aren't just numbers, they are human beings who feel pain and fear and are being traumatized throughout their lives. UN Women notes that violence disproportionately affects low-income countries, but our country is no beacon when it comes to women's safety. Last week was the very sad first anniversary of Sarah Everett's horrific murder by a Metropolitan Police officer. The police's response to the Clapham Commons vigil was violent too. Today we are still waiting to hear of serious steps to stamp out misogyny once and for all in the Met. But it's not just police forces. Misogyny is deeply ingrained within our culture, being present everywhere, from schools to nightclubs to the courts. Drink spiking has received a lot of public attention recently. It is a particularly vile form of violence against women and girls. 1/3 of women have been spiked or know someone who has. The government's end-to-end rape review has laid bare the failures of the criminal justice system. Less than 2% of rape cases ended in conviction last year, adding insult to injury to survivors who find the strength to come forward and report rape. Only 1 in 6 women actually do. They mistrust the system, and no wonder they do. So, what has been done within the last year to break the bias, to ensure nobody is disadvantaged by their gender? Well, not enough. While racism and homophobia are considered hate crimes, misogyny is not, despite nearly every woman having experienced gender-based harassment. Misogyny, in my view, and we have discussed it, Madam Deputy Speaker, but I'm still convinced it must become a hate crime. While it is not a silver bullet, there are many reasons why such a measure would mean progress. It would allow for more accurate data collection of harassment and make such data collections mandatory. It would mean progress. It would set a precedent that such behaviour is unacceptable, and it would curb street harassment that 68% of all women experience on a nearly daily basis. It would stamp out low-level behaviour based in misogyny, and it would make that it doesn't lead to much more serious offences that are based in misogyny. So misogyny needs to be tackled in all settings, and I have talked also about age-appropriate education on consent in schools. An age-appropriate relationship education delivered by experts in every school would be a very good start, and it cannot be left to a postcode lottery. Some schools are doing it very well. But I believe, and I've said this before, it can't be for math or language teachers to do this important work. It has to be delivered by experts. As the crisis in Ukraine continues to unfold, many women will become displaced and especially vulnerable. We cannot allow refugees from Ukraine or elsewhere to fall into the arms of traffickers or abusers. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, this government must listen to and champion women's voices. They are the agents of change. We women have made progress, often painful and slow. We still have a long way to go. But I also want to echo the words of the Honourable Member for Bristol South. It is fun to be a woman. It is important to be here. And for everybody who listens to our debate today, come forward. We need you. Thank you.
Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a privilege to stand here and close this debate for my party, and it has been a pleasure to listen to many eloquent and important speeches across the House this afternoon. I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Member for Basingstoke for bringing the debate today. I actually found it very difficult to know what I wanted to say this year. I felt that there was so much that I might want to cover, particularly given the situation in Ukraine, and I will try and touch on some of that, but I also felt a bit deflated, if I'm honest, because in other ways I could have really easily given the same speech today that I gave last year, because...
I should say to the Honourable Lady that I indicated to her that she didn't have very long, but fortunately people have been quite brief, so she has a little longer than I indicated. Kirsten Oswald.
I'm grateful for that, Madam Deputy Speaker. We'll see how we get on. I think it does feel a wee bit like Groundhog Day in these debates sometimes, and the reason for that is that women still do have to strain every sinew, and not so much changes despite that. But there are bright spots among that, as the previous speaker put very well, and I do want to acknowledge and celebrate them as well. Madam Deputy Speaker, nobody here will be anything other than deeply concerned for the women and girls in Ukraine as they walk away from what were their perfectly normal lives in this unimaginably terrible situation and leaving everything that they've known behind them. And as an aside, for goodness sake, let's waive these visas and let these women in.
Hear, hear.
And all of us will have seen the footage of the women who'd gone into hospital to give birth, but instead are being carried out heavily pregnant, injured, on stretchers, under fire at the very time in their lives when they are at their most vulnerable. It's almost too much to comprehend. And we'll probably, and hopefully, never know what it is to walk in these women's shoes, but we absolutely do stand with them in the face of this wickedness. And there are so many shocking tales from Ukraine, familiar no doubt to women and girls in war zones across the world, and the Honourable Member for Erith and Thamesmead set that out very clearly. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I also saw footage of a whole bunch of pushchairs and prams parked up outside a railway station in Poland by mums who must have known that the mums who were fleeing Ukraine with their wee ones would need them. I thought that was amazing, and it was a chink of light in the darkness there. Now, I know that the theme of this year's International Women's Day is breaking the bias, and I think that is a welcome focus. From my point of view, at home and further afield, the lens that everything is seen through, the lens that decisions are made which affect our lives across the world, is still a male one. And that applies whether we look at work, at health, we've talked about the recovery from COVID, in politics, and too often that bias, these barriers, or that ingrained misogyny remains. So I was very pleased to see Baroness Helena Kennedy's report on misogyny and criminal justice in Scotland. I think that that is a welcome step forward. And as the report highlights, not all men are misogynists, but all women experience misogyny. And I'm heartened too by the continued laser focus of our First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, and her gender-balanced cabinet on this. And the Scottish Parliament continues to become more diverse, slowly but surely, and to be honest, it has been far too slow. But it is changing to reflect the Scotland, and I think the Scotland we know, and I think that we are the better for that, because we need our representation to reflect all of us. And making sure that we actively support marginalised communities and all of that is really important. Regardless of that, politics might not always be a comfortable space to inhabit, and I take the honourable member's point that we should enjoy it as much as we can. But there is often a nasty undercurrent, online in particular, and that is wearing, but we do need women in politics. A woman's place is in politics, a woman's place is in decision-making, and we can see that when that's true, there are better ways to do things. Like in Scotland, for instance, there has been world-leading legislation to provide free period products, for instance. Legislation developed directly with women's organisations that acknowledges domestic abuse as much more than just physical violence, and a determination to incorporate into Scots law the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And we also have a fantastic women's health plan in Scotland. I think that's so important, and the focus on the menopause, which has for far too long been something that is unspoken, is profoundly helpful, and I've been very pleased to hear a number of honourable members mention the menopause today. So I really welcome that focus on women's health. I am a woman with polycystic ovary syndrome, and I'm not alone in that. 10% of women worldwide experience either PCOS or endometriosis. But the thing is, less than 3% of UK research funding goes into researching women's specific conditions. That's women's specific conditions as a whole, not the condition that I'm referring to. And that condition, PCOS, is little understood. There's basically a black hole where research should be. And if you want to know how that might impact on the menopause or on becoming an older woman, you can forget it. The information doesn't exist. But I have no doubt that if that condition affected men, that research would have been done. Just as if men experienced the levels of sexual violence that women do, then we would not have seen what has been a disgraceful pantomime of Raith Rovers Football Club and Clyde Football Clubs transferring, then retransferring, then trying to untransfer a man who had been ruled in a civil case to be a rapist. And I must say that I felt that Raith Rovers' International Women's Day tweet, waxing lyrical about forging women's equality together, was somewhat bold or just extremely offensive, given the circumstances. And I've seen some people, men actually, ask why that had never seemed to be a problem before. Why now, they're asking, suggesting, and some actually saying, that those of us who are unhappy about this are jumping on a bandwagon. Well, I'll tell them why. We are ground down by this kind of thing, day in and day out, and thank goodness we've made enough progress over the past few years that women are feeling able to say, enough. So the incredibly brave woman who found herself at the heart of this, and these strong, principled female players and coaches and teams and supporters who were not willing to stand for this any longer, I take my hat off to them all. And to the men who stood up with them, I say thank you. So we all need to do that. We all need to stand up if we want to break that bias at every level. But it's not easy, and that sorry episode should never have happened. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to close by reflecting on the difference that individual women make. Women going about their lives, but improving the lives of others as they do it. And we all know these women. They're all around us. They're our families, they're our friends. And they are absolutely worth celebrating in this debate. Women like my three East Renfrewshire councillor colleagues, Angela Convery, Annette Ireland and Caroline Bamforth, who work tirelessly day in and day out to improve the lives of others. Women like the three young East Renfrewshire women who were named in the YWCA Scotland's 30 under 30 list, Marissa Roxburgh, Elise Kelly and Ciara Hendry. Women like Rena Maguire, Ashley McElvenny, Anne-Marie Strain and Una McKinnon, who work tirelessly in delivering transformational change in our community. And I'm sure that you will wish them all well. They're all up against one another for a community award. I think that they probably all deserve to win. And I could go on adding the names of amazing women in my community. I could stand here all day and do that. And I am very confident that all the honourable members here could do the same for their constituencies. And also women like Carolyn and Nix, Tracy, Katie and Freya, who support me as I support constituents. These women the world over, going about their business, stepping up, stepping forward, making things better for others and for those coming after them. These are the women who inspire me daily. So let's all try and be more like these women. Let's always stretch a hand out to others as we continue to push forward. And maybe then we'll see real and sustained equality.
Shadow Minister Annalise Dodds.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's such a pleasure to speak in this debate as we mark International Women's Day. I'd like to thank the Right Honourable Member for Basingstoke, of course, for proposing this debate, and the Backbench Business Committee for securing it. And hasn't it been wonderful to hear so many examples of incredible women this afternoon, in fields from science to business, health, education, the arts, politics, trade unions and more. And hasn't it been important also to celebrate, as my friend for Bristol South quite rightly said, how wonderful it is to be a woman. But as we celebrate those examples today, that celebration is tempered, as was mentioned earlier, by the realisation of the dreadful situation so many other women are in. The previous Select Committee statement drew attention to the appalling circumstances for so many women and girls in Afghanistan, rightly underlined by my honourable friend for Kingston upon Hull North in her remarks. And many speakers quite rightly have also expressed sympathy and solidarity with the women and girls of Ukraine. As so many have said, it's hard for us here to imagine the horror and anguish they've faced over the last few weeks, whether they're still in Ukraine under Russian bombardment, or whether they've fled for safety, leaving brothers, partners, fathers and sons behind. And so many have referred in this debate to what took place yesterday, with the Russian army bombing a maternity hospital in Mariupol, almost too appalling to contemplate. I think for many of us, also, it is horrendous to contemplate the circumstances for those women now having to give birth in bomb shelters in those areas under attack. Putin's invasion is an attack on sovereignty, democracy, freedom, the rule of law and women. Now, yesterday, Ukraine's First Lady, Olena Zelenska, offered her testimony from Ukraine. In it, she named some of the child casualties of the war, like Alice, Paulina, and Arseny. In their name, we fully support, and I'm sure I speak for the whole House, providing the people of Ukraine with all possible political, economic, and practical support to repel Putin's forces. Now, this afternoon, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've heard another awful list of names. That read out by my honourable friend, the member for Birmingham Yardley. Her testimony, delivered as we know every year in this debate, highlights the shocking scale of the epidemic of violence against women in this country, without losing sight of the individual tragedy that lies behind every statistic. As she said, the perpetrators killed, but we in power can and must do better. My colleagues here and in the other place have time and time again brought pressure to bear, not least during the passage of the Police Crime and Sentencing Bill. We argued for the inclusion of domestic abuse and sexual offences in the definition of serious violence, for violence against women and girls to be a strategic policing requirement, giving it the same prominence as terrorism and organised crime, for safeguards on the extraction of data from victims' phones, for a lifting of the limit on the prosecution of common assault or battery in domestic abuse cases, for a review, finally, also into spiking, so we can get to the bottom of this appalling practice. None of these measures were included in the original bill. All of them were the result of campaigning with powerful women's organisations beyond this House. They were all achieved, I'm sorry to say, in the teeth of government opposition. Now, outside that specific legislation, it was also pressure from those organisations from this side of the House that resulted in violence against women and girls becoming a strategic policing requirement, giving it the same prominence as terrorism and organised crime. But there's so much more to do. And as my friend for Canterbury said, we need drastic action that recognises this is an emergency. So will the government now introduce the other measures contained in our comprehensive Green Paper? Will she ensure there will be a specialist rape unit in every police force area? Will they bring in minimum sentences for rape and for stalking? Will they make misogyny a hate crime, as has rightly been called for? And will they publish a perpetrator strategy, as the Domestic Abuse Bill requires this to happen before the end of next month? Now, violence against women and girls, male violence, as was rightly said, is not just a criminal justice issue, it is also a public health one. More than 60% of women accessing mental health services have experienced domestic abuse. An appalling statistic at the heart of the Women's Aid campaign deserved to be heard, rightly promoted by my friend for Poplar and Limehouse. It's one of many reasons why we have committed that we would guarantee mental health treatment within a month for all who need it and enable 1 million more people to access treatment. We had high hopes, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the government would be similarly ambitious when this time last year it announced we'd have a new women's health strategy by the end of 2021. Well, it's now March 2022 and we're still waiting. In fact, we're waiting longer and longer for cervical screening appointments, for breast cancer appointments, for routine gynaecological treatment. We're seeing services cut or in line to be cut, such as that access for telemedicine for early abortion that rightly has been referred to by so many members today. And we're seeing areas of extreme need, such as PCOS and endo, still not being dealt with properly. And life expectancy and outcomes for many women are actually worsening. As my friend for Coventry North West has repeatedly emphasised, black women are now 40% more likely than white women to experience miscarriage and 4 times more likely to die while pregnant. Yet we still lack any hard targets for improvement. Now, waiting lists were already at record highs, even before COVID-19 hit. But we can do something about this. Previous governments from the opposition reduced waiting times from 18 months to 18 weeks. We've got to learn from that change, act on it and secure the future of our NHS, providing the staff, equipment and modern technology it needs to treat women on time. And we also now, more than ever, need change for women in our economy. As so many have said, my party introduced the Equal Pay Act, the Sex Discrimination Act and the Equality Act, rightly referred to by the member for Edinburgh South West as a Labour achievement. Those advances were often delivered hand in hand with the trade union movement. We understand that our society, our economy, our country is poorer if women cannot play their part. Women hold the key to a stronger economy. Women-led SMEs contribute about £85 billion to economic output, and companies where women are more prominent are ultimately more successful. And yet, we still see women are less likely to be able to access as much finance as men when they try to set up companies, and only 8 in all the 100 FTSE CEOs are women. Backing women in business isn't just the right thing to do, it makes hard-headed economic sense. Yet we're still dragging our feet. We cannot do that any longer. That's why we've committed to 100,000 new businesses, many of them run by women, in the first term of a Labour government. And it's also why we would act to boost family-friendly employment rights. Last year, the gender pay gap actually increased, one of the few statistics that hasn't been mentioned yet within this debate. But that followed a decade of slower reductions than were seen under the Labour government, as referred to by my friend for Streatham. And as my friends for Jarrow and Coventry North East said, this has been accelerated, much of this precarity for women, during the pandemic. We need gender pay comparisons across companies, as well as ethnicity pay reporting, to tackle compound inequalities. We need to tackle workplace harassment, including third-party harassment. We need to implement the International Labour Organisation's Convention against workplace harassment. And we need to ensure flexibilities in the hands of women workers, not just their employers, as is so often the case currently. We must recognise childcare as the fundamental economic infrastructure that it is, not the afterthought it so often seems to be for too many women and families in our country. And we need to finally measure the impact of policies on women, as the government should do legally. Madam Deputy Speaker, International Women's Day is always a bittersweet moment. A chance to celebrate how far we've come, a chance to note with regret how far we still have to go, a chance to recommit ourselves to the struggle for women and girls today and for our daughters and granddaughters tomorrow. My party now has as many women MPs as the proportion of women in the country, aiding us in the struggle, but there's still so much more to do, as has been said, particularly in local government, as the Right Honourable Member for Basingstoke said, and my friend for Erith and Thamesmead. And it's also critical that we prevent the abuse of women in social media. And I have to say, I do commend for her honesty the member for North Devon, who spoke, I think, very powerfully about the impact of this on women politicians. And I would say, in reflection on some of the discussion that took place previously, it always makes sense to check what a woman has actually said, rather than what a man suggests she has said on social media. To conclude, women across our country deserve security, prosperity and respect. That's what a Labour government will seek to ensure. And for as long as we're on these benches, it's what we will deliver as we seek to break the bias. Thank you.
Minister Trudy